There are characters in video games that linger in your memory long after you've put down the controller. Characters whose stories resonate not because they're simple heroes or villains, but because they exist in that uncomfortable gray space between the two. Natural Harmonia Gropius, known simply as N, is one such character. His tale is not one of triumph or clear-cut villainy. His story is a tragedy in the truest sense, a narrative woven with manipulation, misguided ideals, and ultimately painful growth. Before we dive deep into this journey, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's something fascinating about how stories like N's can reach people across different time zones, different continents, all united by their love for these games. And hey, if you find yourself getting invested in this story, if N's tragedy resonates with you the way it did with me, consider leaving a like. It helps more people discover these deep dives into the lore we all love. N's appearance in Pokémon Black and White marked a turning point for the franchise. For the first time, players encountered an antagonist who genuinely believed in what he was doing. He wasn't seeking world domination for power's sake, nor was he driven by simple greed or revenge. N wanted to save Pokémon from what he perceived as their suffering at human hands. His methods were extreme, his worldview warped by years of careful manipulation, but his heart, tragically, was pure. To understand N's tragedy, we must first understand that he was never meant to be his own person. From the moment Ghetsis Harmonia Gropius found him in that forest, N was a tool, a means to an end, a perfectly crafted instrument designed to achieve someone else's ambitions. The green-haired young man who would become the king of Team Plasma was molded, shaped, and broken long before players ever encountered him in Accumula Town. His story begins not with grand declarations or legendary dragons, but with a child alone in the wilderness, speaking a language most humans had forgotten. The forests of Unova hold many secrets, ancient places where the boundary between the human world and the realm of Pokémon grows thin. It was in one such forest that a boy, perhaps 4 years old, lived a life that no human child should have lived. This child, who would later be known as N, had been abandoned by his biological father. The reasons remain shrouded in mystery, whispered about but never confirmed. Some accounts suggest he was originally named Nathaniel, though this detail, like so much of N's early life, exists more in speculation than in verified fact. What we do know with certainty is that this child possessed a gift, an ability so rare and so profound that it would shape the entire trajectory of his life. N could hear the voices of Pokémon, not in the vague, intuitive way that experienced trainers learn to read their partner's moods and needs, but truly hear them, understand them, speak with them as easily as one human might converse with another. This extraordinary ability manifested early. According to fragments of his history, young N showed signs of his gift before he could properly speak human language. He would coo and babble to the family's Lillipup, and the Pokémon would respond, and somehow, impossibly, they understood each other. His father, unable to comprehend or perhaps frightened by this supernatural connection, tried to encourage the boy to play with other human children. But N had no interest in human companionship. He would cry when separated from Pokémon, would grow anxious and distressed without their presence nearby. By the age of 3, N communicated almost exclusively with Pokémon. Human speech became secondary to him, a language he understood but had little use for. The Pokémon in his life, they were his family, his friends, his entire world. They didn't judge him for being different. They didn't find his abilities strange or frightening. To them, he was simply another voice in the conversation, another soul in the community. When his father finally abandoned him in the forest, perhaps it was an act of desperation, perhaps it was cruelty, or perhaps he truly believed his son would be happier among the creatures he loved more than his own kind. Whatever the reasoning, the result was the same. A young child was left alone in the wilderness, cut off from human society, left to survive or perish as fate would have it. But In didn't perish. The Pokémon of the forest took him in, cared for him, raised him as one of their own. For roughly a year, he lived this way, completely immersed in Pokémon society. He learned their ways, their customs, their methods of communication that went far beyond simple cries and calls. He understood the complex social structures of Pokémon communities, the hierarchies, the cooperation, the conflicts and resolutions. He saw how Pokémon cared for each other, how they protected their young, how they worked together to overcome challenges. During this time, Anne's understanding of Pokémon reached depths that few humans could ever hope to achieve. He didn't just hear their voices, he understood their hearts, their dreams, their fears, their joys. When a Pokémon was hungry, N felt that hunger. When they were content, its contentment flooded through him. When they suffered, he suffered with them. This complete immersion in Pokémon society, this year of living as one of them, became the foundation of everything N would later believe. It taught him that Pokémon were not mere animals to be caught and commanded, not tools to be used, not even just companions. They were people in their own right, with thoughts and feelings as complex and valid as any humans. They had agency, desires, the capacity for both happiness and suffering, but it also gave him an incomplete picture of the world. Anne saw Pokémon in their natural state, living freely, making their own choices, existing in harmony with nature and each other. He never saw the partnerships that could exist between humans and Pokémon built on mutual respect and love. He never witnessed the joy a Pokémon could find in battling alongside a trusted trainer, the pride they could take in growing stronger, the bonds that could form through shared struggles and triumphs. This one-sided education would prove to be his greatest vulnerability, the crack in his foundation that Ghetsis would later exploit to devastating effect. When Ghetsis Harmonia Gropius discovered the boy living wild in the forest, he didn't see a lost child in need of rescue. He saw an opportunity. Ghetsis, a man whose ambitions stretched far beyond the boundaries of moral behavior, recognized immediately what this child represented. A boy who could speak to Pokémon, who had lived among them, who commanded their trust and affection naturally, could become the perfect figurehead for the organization Ghetsis was building. Team Plasma needed a king, a symbol of purity and noble intention to inspire the masses. This strange, feral child could be shaped into exactly that symbol. The moment Ghetsis took N from that forest marked the true beginning of the tragedy. What could have been a rescue, a return to human society, a chance for N to integrate his unique gifts into a balanced worldview, instead became the start of years of careful, calculated manipulation. Ghetsis brought N to his castle, the massive structure that would later rise from the earth to surround the Pokémon League. In those early days, the castle was still under construction, built in secret by Pokémon that Team Plasma had taken from their trainers. The irony would have been apparent to anyone with eyes to see it. Pokémon forced to work against their will to build a headquarters for an organization claiming to fight for Pokémon liberation. But N, only 4 or 5 years old, traumatized by abandonment, barely able to speak human language, saw only that Ghetsis had brought him to a place filled with Pokémon. The reintegration process was difficult. N had spent a formative year living as a Pokémon, and reverting to human patterns of behavior and communication required extensive effort. 2 young women, Anthea and Concordia, were assigned to care for N, to teach him to speak properly again, to walk like a human, to use tools and wear clothes, and follow the basic conventions of human society. Anthea and Concordia were themselves orphans that Ghetsis had adopted, though unlike N, they had been raised in more traditional circumstances. They served as his foster sisters, his caretakers, and later his companions. The 2 women genuinely cared for N in their way. They would sneak into his quarters when Ghetsis wasn't watching, bringing their own Pokémon to play with him, offering him moments of simple joy and companionship. But their care, well-meaning as it might have been, couldn't counteract the systematic psychological conditioning that Ghetsis subjected N to. From the moment of his adoption, every aspect of N's environment was carefully controlled to shape his worldview in very specific ways. Ghetsis' manipulation was masterful in its subtlety and its cruelty. He didn't forbid N from interacting with Pokémon. That would have been counterproductive. Instead, he curated which Pokémon N was allowed to encounter. Every single Pokémon that N met during his childhood had been abused, neglected, or mistreated by humans in some way. Some bore physical scars from cruel trainers. Others had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves when they were no longer wanted. Still others had been used as tools, worked until exhaustion, then discarded. Day after day, year after year, N heard the story of these wounded souls. He felt their pain, their fear, their betrayal. They told him of trainers who saw them as nothing more than weapons to be wielded, of humans who cared only for winning battles and gaining prestige. They spoke of cold nights abandoned on the streets, of hunger, of injuries left untreated, of being forced to fight even when they were exhausted or hurt. For a child with N's empathic abilities, this constant exposure to trauma became his entire understanding of what the relationship between humans and Pokémon looked like. He had no frame of reference for the loving partnerships that existed throughout the Unova region and beyond. He never met Pokémon who adored their trainers, who eagerly participated in battles because they enjoyed the challenge and the chance to grow stronger alongside their human partners. He never witnessed the countless acts of kindness and care that trainers showed their Pokémon every single day. Ghetsis made sure of that. Every piece of evidence that contradicted the narrative he was building was carefully filtered out. N's world became an echo chamber where the only message was that humans were cruel, that Pokémon suffered under human control, that the only way to save them was to separate the 2 species entirely. The castle became N's prison, though he didn't recognize it as such. He lived primarily in his room, a space that Ghetsis had designed to be both childlike and isolating. The walls were painted with clouds, the floor covered in soft materials. Toys littered the space, a train set, a skateboard ramp marked with scratches from Pokémon claws, a basketball hoop on the wall. Near that hoop lay a basketball with a single word inscribed on it, Harmonia, the surname Ghetsis had given his adopted son. The room tells us so much about N's childhood. These toys, signs of a life that should have been filled with play and innocence, instead represented isolation. The scratches on the ramp indicated that Pokémon had used it, suggesting that N's primary playmates were the wounded Pokémon Ghetsis brought him, not other children. The mathematical formulas and puzzles scattered throughout the room revealed a brilliant mind, one that Ghetsis cultivated and directed toward specific ends. According to Junichi Masuda, one of the developers behind Pokémon Black and White, N's brain functioned faster than a computer. His IQ was extraordinary, his grasp of mathematics and sociology far beyond his years. The name natural that Ghetsis gave him was a reference to natural numbers, the integers used in counting and ordering. Everything about N's identity, even his name, was a construct designed to serve Ghetsis' purposes. N excelled in his studies, not because Ghetsis encouraged education for its own sake, but because an intelligent, articulate king would be more effective in swaying public opinion. N learned to analyze social structures, to understand how societies function, how beliefs spread through populations, how to craft messages that would resonate with people's existing values and concerns. He became proficient in multiple disciplines, his mind racing through problems and solutions at speeds that left ordinary people struggling to keep up. But all of this intelligence, all of this capability, was focused through the lens of the worldview Ghetsis had instilled in him. N became convinced that he was uniquely positioned to save Pokémon from suffering. He had lived among them, understood them in ways no other human could, and he had witnessed firsthand the pain that human cruelty could inflict. The logic from his perspective was unassailable. If humans caused Pokémon to suffer, then separating humans from Pokémon would end that suffering. The isolation ensured that N never developed the social skills or the emotional maturity that might have allowed him to question this logic. He had no friends his own age, no peers to challenge his assumptions or offer different perspectives. Anthea and Concordia cared for him, but they were also under Ghetsis' control, and they believed in the mission of Team Plasma, even if they didn't understand the true depths of Ghetsis' manipulation. As N grew from a child into a teenager and then a young man, Ghetsis began to reveal to him the plan that had been in motion since the day of his adoption. Team Plasma, Ghetsis explained, was an organization dedicated to Pokémon liberation. They would convince the people of Unova to release their Pokémon, to recognize that the practice of catching, training, and battling Pokémon was a form of slavery. And N, with his ability to speak to Pokémon and his pure-hearted dedication to their well-being, would be the king of this movement. The idea of becoming a king, of leading a revolution that would free Pokémon from suffering, appealed to everything N believed in. He had seen the evidence of human cruelty his entire conscious life. He had heard the voices of countless Pokémon crying out for freedom from their pain. How could he refuse? How could he not dedicate himself completely to this noble cause? Ghetsis presented N with the ancient legend of Unova, the tale that would become the framework for everything Team Plasma attempted to achieve. According to this legend, thousands of years ago, the Unova region had been founded by twin heroes. These brothers possessed a single, mighty dragon Pokémon, a creature of immense power that helped them unite the warring peoples of the land and establish the kingdom that would eventually become the Unova region. But as often happens with power, the brothers began to disagree. The older brother sought truth, the objective reality of the world, facts and evidence and proven knowledge. The younger brother pursued ideals, the vision of what the world could become, the principles and values that should guide society forward. Truth and ideals, both noble pursuits, both essential to wisdom, but when taken to extremes and set in opposition to each other, capable of tearing even the strongest bonds apart. The dragon, unable to choose between the two brothers it loved equally, could not decide which path was correct. And so, in response to this fundamental conflict, the dragon split itself into two separate beings. Reshiram, vast and white, burning with the fires of truth, sided with the older brother. Zekrom, dark and powerful, crackling with the electricity of ideals, sided with the younger. Left behind was Kurem, an empty husk, a shell of ice that contained neither truth nor ideals, but only the yearning to be whole again. The brothers battled, Reshiram and Zekrom clashing in conflicts that shook the region. But neither could claim victory, for truth and ideals are equally important, equally powerful in their own ways. Eventually, seeing that neither could prove themselves superior, the brothers reached a truce. They recognized that both truth and ideals were necessary, that the world needed both to flourish, but the peace didn't last. Years later, the sons of these heroes reignited the conflict, and this time, the battle between Reshiram and Zekrom nearly destroyed the entire region. The devastation was so complete, the destruction so terrible, that both dragons realized they had gone too far. They ceased their battle and transformed themselves into dormant stones, the light stone and the dark stone, waiting for new heroes worthy of their power to emerge. This legend was more than just an old story to Ghetsis. It was a blueprint. He explained to N that if they could awaken one of these legendary dragons, if N could prove himself worthy to be recognized as a hero in the ancient tradition, then the people of Unova would listen to his message. The spiritual and symbolic power of having a legendary Pokémon at his side would lend credence to his cause, would make it impossible for people to dismiss Team Plasma's ideology as mere radical activism. N embraced this plan with the fervent dedication of someone who had never been taught to question, to doubt, to consider alternative perspectives. He would become the hero of legend, would bond with Reshiram or Zekrom, would use that partnership to convince everyone in Unova that Pokémon and humans must be separated for the good of all. But there was a deeper layer to this plan, one that Ghetsis kept carefully hidden from his adopted son. Ghetsis didn't actually care about Pokémon liberation. He didn't believe in the ideology he was preaching, the entire philosophy of Team Plasma, the speeches about Pokémon rights and ending their suffering. All of it was an elaborate deception designed to achieve a much simpler and much more sinister goal. Ghetsis wanted power. He wanted to rule the Unova region without opposition, to establish himself as the supreme authority, accountable to no one. And he realized that the most effective way to achieve this was to convince everyone else to give up their Pokémon. If every trainer in Unova could be persuaded or coerced into releasing their Pokémon, then Ghetsis and Team Plasma would be the only ones left with Pokémon, giving them an insurmountable military advantage. No one could stand against them. No gym leaders, no Elite Four, no champion, no police force or citizen militia could resist Team Plasma if Team Plasma alone possessed the power of Pokémon. N was the linchpin of this plan. Ghetsis couldn't preach this message himself. He was too obviously self-interested, too clearly ambitious. But N, pure-hearted N, naive N N, who genuinely believed every word of the propaganda he had been fed since childhood. N could be the face of the movement. His sincerity would be unquestionable because it was real. His dedication would inspire others because it came from a place of genuine conviction. And when the time came, when everyone had released their Pokémon and Ghetsis stood poised to seize control, N would be discarded, his usefulness exhausted, his purpose fulfilled. This is the core of N's tragedy. He was never fighting for his own ambitions. He didn't seek power or glory or recognition. He wanted only to end what he perceived as the suffering of Pokémon, to give them the freedom he believed they deserved. Every action he took, every battle he fought, every speech he gave, all of it came from a place of love for Pokémon and a desire to protect them. But that love had been weaponized. His compassion had been turned into a tool of manipulation. The purity of his intentions had been exploited to serve someone else's lust for dominance. N was simultaneously the hero of his own story and the pawn in someone else's game, and he wouldn't realize the truth until it was far too late. As N reached adulthood, Ghetsis began to put the plan into motion. The 7 sages, the highest-ranking members of Team Plasma after N himself, began appearing throughout the Unova region. Ghetsis led them, his distinctive appearance marking him as someone of importance. He wore elaborate robes decorated with eye symbols, one side purple and the other yellow, representing the duality at the heart of Team Plasma's public facade, the noble intentions hiding the sinister reality. A red monocle covered his right eye, and he kept his right arm hidden. Within his robes, hints at a history of violence and injury that suggested this man's cruelty extended even to his own well-being. The other sages, Zinzalin, Rude, Ryoku, Gorm, Giallo, and Bronius, were each named after colors in various languages. Another example of Ghetsis' preference for symbolism and carefully crafted imagery. They dressed in tall hats and robes colored according to their namesakes, presenting themselves as wise counselors, philosophers dedicated to a higher cause. Team Plasma grunts, meanwhile, adopted uniforms styled after medieval knights, complete with helmets and armor motifs. This design choice was deliberate, intended to evoke images of chivalry, of honorable warriors fighting for justice and righteousness. Their coat of arms, a shield split between black and white bearing a blue pea, further reinforced the themes of duality and balance that Ghetsis wanted the public to associate with Team Plasma. The speeches began in small towns and cities throughout Unova. Ghetsis would gather crowds and speak in passionate, stirring rhetoric about the plight of Pokémon. He painted a picture of creatures suffering in captivity, trapped in Pokeballs, forced to fight battles they didn't want to participate in, their entire existence reduced to serving human desires. The message was crafted to appeal to people's compassion, to make them question practices they had taken for granted their entire lives. Some people were moved by these speeches. They looked at their Pokémon and wondered if they truly were happy, if the partnerships they thought they had built were actually forms of oppression. A few trainers actually did release their Pokémon, convinced that it was the right thing to do. But most people in Unova recognized Team Plasma for what they were, an extremist organization with a distorted view of the human-Pokémon relationship. The moderate citizens of Unova had lived alongside Pokémon their entire lives. They had seen the bonds that formed between trainers and their partners. They knew Pokémon who loved their trainers, who chose to stay with them even when given the opportunity to leave, who battled not because they were forced to, but because they enjoyed the challenge and the chance to grow stronger. They saw through Team Plasma's simplistic narrative and rejected it, but Team Plasma wasn't just making speeches. They were also taking action, often criminal action. Team Plasma grunts would steal Pokémon from trainers, claiming they were liberating the creatures from captivity. They would interfere with legitimate Pokémon battles, accusing the participants of cruelty. They infiltrated places like the Dream Yard, attempting to steal a Munna to obtain Dream Mist, which they intended to use to spread their propaganda more effectively by literally invading people's dreams. These criminal activities revealed the contradiction at the heart of Team Plasma's ideology. They claimed to fight for Pokémon freedom, but they were perfectly willing to steal Pokémon, to use Pokémon against their will for Team Plasma's own purposes. The grunts justified this by claiming that once Team Plasma achieved their goals, all Pokémon would be free. So temporary use of Pokémon was acceptable if it served the greater good. It was rationalization, a way to avoid confronting the hypocrisy of their actions. Throughout all of this, N remained largely separate from the day-to-day operations of Team Plasma. He didn't participate in the theft and violence. He didn't lead the grunts on their raids. Instead, he focused on his own mission, preparing to awaken one of the legendary dragons and prove himself worthy to be called a hero. But he also began to encounter the protagonist of Pokémon Black and White, a young trainer from Unova Town who had recently received their first Pokémon and embarked on the traditional journey through the Unova region. This trainer would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The opposing hero who would challenge not just N's actions, but the very foundations of his beliefs. Their first meeting happened in Accumula Town shortly after one of Ghetsis' speeches. N approached the young trainer, intrigued by the Pokémon they carried. Using his unique ability, N spoke directly to the trainer's Pokémon, asking it about its life, its feelings about its trainer, its experiences with being caught and commanded. What N heard shocked him. The Pokémon spoke not of suffering or captivity, but of happiness. It liked its trainer, it enjoyed battling. It looked forward to growing stronger alongside its partner. This wasn't what N had been told to expect. Every Pokémon he had spoken to before had tales of woe and mistreatment, but this Pokémon and the trainer standing before him represented something N's worldview couldn't easily accommodate. Disturbed by this encounter, N challenged the trainer to a battle. He wanted to understand, to test whether this Pokémon's contentment was genuine or merely Stockholm Syndrome, a creature that had been broken to accept its captivity. The battle was brief, N's Pokémon falling to the trainers. But more importantly, throughout the battle, N watched the interaction between trainer and Pokémon. He saw the encouragement, the care, the mutual respect. After the battle, N left quickly, troubled by what he had witnessed. He told himself that this must be an exception, that this one trainer didn't represent the norm, but a seed of doubt had been planted. The first crack in the foundation of absolute certainty that Ghetsis had spent years constructing. This doubt would grow with each subsequent encounter between N and the protagonist. They battled again outside the Nakreen City Museum, and again N saw the bond between trainer and Pokémon. They spoke on the Ferris wheel in Nimbasa City, where N revealed his identity as the king of Team Plasma and explained his intentions. and still the trainer's Pokémon sang praises of their partnership. N began to call the protagonist his friend, one of the only people outside of Anthea and Concordia that he used that term for. He recognized in this trainer someone who truly cared for Pokémon, who didn't see them as tools or weapons, but as companions. Yet this person also contradicted everything N believed about the relationship between humans and Pokémon. The encounters weren't all friendly conversation though. In Chargestone Cave, when Professor Juniper and the trainer's friend Bianca joined a conversation with N, he expressed his disgust at the Pokédex. To N, the device represented the ultimate objectification of Pokémon, reducing them to data to be collected and cataloged, turning the diversity and individuality of Pokémon into mere statistics in a database. He stormed off from that conversation, angry and frustrated, but he was also increasingly confused. Every piece of evidence he encountered contradicted what he had been taught. Most trainers seemed to genuinely care for their Pokémon. Most Pokémon seemed happy with their trainers. The suffering he had been told was universal appeared to be the exception rather than the rule. But N couldn't quite bring himself to abandon his beliefs. He had invested everything in the cause of Pokémon liberation. His entire identity was built around being the person who would save Pokémon from human cruelty. To admit that his understanding of the world was wrong would be to admit that everything he had dedicated his life to was based on a false premise. That kind of cognitive dissonance, that fundamental challenge to one's core beliefs, is almost impossible to process without help and support. And N had no one to help him process it. Anthea and Concordia believed in Team Plasma's mission. Ghetsis certainly wasn't going to help N question the ideology he had spent years instilling. The Team Plasma grunts worshipped N as their king. They weren't going to challenge his beliefs. N was alone with his doubts, struggling to reconcile what he had always believed with what he was increasingly seeing. So he pressed forward with the plan. He had come too far to turn back now. Even if doubts troubled him, even if he was no longer completely certain that he was right, he couldn't abandon the mission. Too many people were counting on him. The Pokémon who had suffered needed someone to fight for them. He would awaken the dragon, would challenge the Pokémon League, would defeat the champion and stand before all of Unova as the hero of legend, and then everyone would have to listen to his message. The moment came a dragon spiral tower, an ancient spiral structure that reached toward the sky, a place of power and history. Team Plasma had located the Dark Stone in Pokémon White, or the Light Stone in Pokémon Black, and N intended to awaken the dragon within. The protagonist, along with the former champion Alder and several others, arrived to try to stop him, but they were too late. N placed his hand on the stone, spoke to the dragon, sleeping within, and asked it to join him in his mission to create a world where Pokémon and humans lived separately. The stone began to glow, cracks spreading across its surface. Then, in an explosion of light and power, the dragon emerged. Zekrom in Pokémon White, a creature of deep black scales crackling with electrical energy, the embodiment of ideals. Reshiram in Pokémon Black, a magnificent white dragon wreathed in flames, the manifestation of truth. The dragon roared, its voice shaking the very foundations of the tower. It was free after centuries of dormancy, and it turned its gaze upon N, evaluating him, judging whether this human was worthy to be called a hero. N spoke to the dragon, not with words, but with his heart, with his ability to communicate as Pokémon did. He showed the dragon his conviction, his dedication to ending Pokémon suffering. his willingness to do whatever it took to achieve his goal. He poured out his doubts, his confusion, his genuine desire to do what was right, even if he was no longer certain what right meant. And the dragon accepted him. Zekrom or Reshiram, depending on the version, recognized N as a person of strong ideals or firm commitment to truth. The dragon agreed to fight alongside him to help him achieve his goal of confronting the Pokémon League and forcing the people of Unova to confront the questions Team Plasma raised. With the legendary dragon at his side, N left Dragon Spiral Tower flying off on the dragon's back. He left behind a message for the protagonist telling them to find the other dragon, to prove themselves worthy to be recognized as the opposing hero, because if N was going to force this change on the world, he needed to prove that his ideals or his truth was stronger than any opposition. N proceeded to the Pokémon League, the culmination of every trainer's journey through the region. He challenged the Elite Four, defeating each of them with relative ease. The power of the legendary dragon, combined with N's own formidable skills as a trainer, made the battles almost one-sided. Then he faced Alder, the champion of Unova. Alder had been champion for many years, a kind man who believed deeply in the bonds between trainers and Pokémon. He had once suffered the loss of a Pokémon partner to illness, an experience that had shaped his philosophy that trainers should treasure the time they have with their Pokémon and honor their memories when they're gone. The battle between N and Alder was never shown to players, but the result was clear. N won. The champion of Unova fell to the power of the legendary dragon and the determination of the young man who commanded it. For the first time in Unova's history, someone had defeated the champion, not as part of the traditional challenge, but as an act of conquest. At that moment, as N stood victorious over the fallen champion, his castle began to rise. The massive structure, built over years in secret by stolen Pokémon forced to labor, emerged from the ground surrounding the Pokémon League building. Its towers reached into the sky, its walls blocked out the light, its very presence a statement of power and dominance. Team Plasma grunts poured from the castle, surrounding the League and all the people who had gathered there. The 7 sages stood on high balconies, watching the chaos unfold, and N ascended to his throne room at the very top of the castle, waiting for the protagonist to arrive so they could settle this conflict once and for all. Inside the castle, the player climbed through floor after floor. Gym leaders who had rushed to help intercepted the 7 sages, buying time for the protagonist to reach N-Team Plasma grunts. Fill the halls, but strangely most of them didn't fight. Instead, they talked about the victory, about how they would soon have to say goodbye to their Pokémon, about whether releasing their partners was really the right choice. These conversations revealed the doubt that existed even within Team Plasma itself. Many of the grunts had joined the organization because they genuinely believed in the cause. But now that the moment was here, now that they would actually have to release their Pokémon, they were having second thoughts. They had formed bonds with their Pokémon too. They loved their partners. The ideology that had seemed so clear and righteous in the abstract became much more complicated when it meant giving up beings they cared for. On one floor, a Team Plasma scientist explained their plan to hack into the Pokémon storage system, to force the release of every Pokémon stored in PC boxes throughout the entire region. This would ensure that even trainers who resisted the liberation message would lose their Pokémon. It was an act of terrorism disguised as activism, a forced transformation of society that ignored the will of both humans and Pokémon who were happy with their partnerships. On another floor, the protagonist encountered Anthea and Concordia. The two women healed the protagonist's Pokémon, an act of kindness that seemed at odds with their allegiance to Team Plasma. Concordia spoke about N's past, about his pure and innocent heart, but she also said something profound. There is nothing more beautiful and terrifying than innocence. That statement encapsulated everything tragic about N. His innocence, his genuine belief that he was doing good, made him beautiful in his dedication and terrifying in his willingness to force massive change on society without fully understanding the consequences. Innocence untempered by experience, by exposure to complexity, by wisdom, can be as dangerous as malice. Finally, the protagonist reached N's room. It was exactly as he had left it, a childlike space filled with toys and puzzles. The basketball with Harmonia written on it. The skateboard ramp scarred by Pokémon claws. This room told the story of a boy who never had a normal childhood, who was isolated and manipulated, who was raised to be a tool rather than a person. Leaving the room, ascending the final stairs, the protagonist entered the throne room. N sat waiting, regal and composed, the legendary dragon at his side. The moment the protagonist entered, their bag began to glow. The light stone, or dark stone, that they had obtained at the guidance of Professor Juniper and various allies, reacted to the presence of its counterpart. The stone flew from the bag, landing in the center of the room, and just as the dragon's spiral tower, it began to crack and glow. The second dragon emerged in a burst of power, Reshiram if the protagonist played black, Zekrom if they played white. The dragon looked at the protagonist, evaluated them just as the other dragon had evaluated N, and found them worthy. Now two legendary dragons faced each other in the throne room, Reshiram and Zekrom, truth and ideals, preparing to clash just as they had thousands of years ago. But this time, the battle was about more than abstract philosophy. It was about whether Pokémon and humans should be separated, whether the bonds between trainers and Pokémon represented oppression or partnership, whether N's vision of liberation or the protagonist's vision of cooperation would determine Unova's future. N healed the protagonist's Pokémon before the battle, an act of courtesy and honor that showed he still believed this conflict should be settled fairly, that whoever won would do so because their conviction was truly stronger, not because they had an unfair advantage. Then the battle began. Human commanding dragon against human commanding dragon, ideals against truth, two visions of the world clashing in the most literal way possible. The battle was long and hard fought. Both trainers were skilled, both dragons were powerful, both sides had absolute conviction in their cause, but ultimately one side had to win, and in both Pokémon Black and White, the canon result is the same. The protagonist emerged victorious. Their dragon defeated N's dragon, proving that their truth or their ideals, depending on version, was stronger. N stood in shock as his dragon acknowledged defeat. He had been so certain, so convinced that he was right, that his cause was just, that he was the hero of the legend. But he had lost. What did that mean? If he wasn't the hero, if his convictions weren't strong enough to achieve victory, then what was he? Before N could process this defeat, before the implications could fully sink in, Ghetsis appeared. The sage strode into the throne room, and the mask of benevolence and wisdom that he had maintained for so long finally came off. Ghetsis was furious. All his plans, years of preparation, generations of work by Team Plasma had come down to this moment, and N had failed him. But more than that, N was no longer necessary. The plan had been exposed. The public would never follow Team Plasma now, and that meant N's usefulness as a figurehead had come to an end. What followed was one of the most brutal verbal assaults in Pokémon history. Ghetsis told N the truth, the full truth that had been hidden from him his entire life. Team Plasma wasn't about Pokémon liberation. It never had been. The entire ideology was a lie, a manipulation designed to convince people to give up their Pokémon so that Ghetsis would be the only one left with them, allowing him to rule Unova unopposed. Ghetsis called N a disappointment, warped, defective, a freak without a human heart. He said N was nothing more than a tool, a pawn, something to be used and discarded when no longer useful. Every kind word, every expression of fatherly pride, every moment of supposed care, all of it had been calculated manipulation. The words hit in like physical blows. His entire worldview, his entire sense of identity, everything he believed about himself and his purpose, shattered in those moments. He had dedicated his entire life to a cause that never existed. He had been manipulated, used, treated as nothing more than a convenient tool by the person he had called father. And then the worst part, the truly devastating part, was that N realized Ghetsis was right about one aspect. N had been wrong. Not about everything. Pokémon really did suffer sometimes at human hands. Abuse and neglect were real problems that needed addressing. But his solution, forcibly separating all Pokémon from all humans, had been extreme and misguided. N thought back to all his encounters with the protagonist, all the Pokémon he had spoken to who were happy with their trainers. He remembered the doubt he had felt, the confusion, the growing sense that maybe his understanding of the world was incomplete. All of those instincts had been correct. He should have listened to them, should have questioned more, should have sought out more perspectives instead of clinging to the beliefs that had been programmed into him. But it was too late for that revelation to change what had already happened. N had led Team Plasma, had helped steal Pokémon, had attacked the Pokémon League, had very nearly forced a catastrophic change on the entire region. The weight of those actions, now that he understood they had been based on lies and manipulation, was crushing. N wanted to help, wanted to make amends, wanted to fight against the person who had used him. But Ghetsis wouldn't allow it. He ordered N to stand aside, then turned his attention to the protagonist. If N wouldn't serve his purpose, then Ghetsis would simply eliminate the person who had defeated N and take what he wanted by force. Ghetsis revealed his team of Pokémon, powerful creatures that included a significantly underleveled Hydreigon, a Pokémon that normally couldn't evolve until level 64, but which Ghetsis' Hydreigon was only level 54. This indicated severe mistreatment, forcing a Pokémon to evolve before it was naturally ready, treating it as nothing more than a tool to be exploited. Ghetsis' Hydreigon even knew the move Frustration, which grows stronger the less the Pokémon likes its trainer, clear evidence of the cruelty Ghetsis subjected his Pokémon to. The injuries Ghetsis bore, the scars on his face, his damaged eye, his limp that necessitated a cane, all seemed to suggest that his own Pokémon had turned on him at some point. Cruelty toward Pokémon had consequences, and Ghetsis carried the marks of those consequences on his body. The battle between Ghetsis and the protagonist was Ghetsis' last chance to salvage his plan through sheer force. But the protagonist, backed by Pokémon who genuinely wanted to fight for them, defeated Ghetsis' team of abused and exploited creatures. The would-be tyrant fell, his perfect plan in ruins, his ambitions thwarted by a child from a small town and their loyal Pokémon. Ghetsis descended into ranting madness, screaming about how his perfect plan could have failed, how he had accounted for everything, how he deserved to rule. Sharon, the protagonist's childhood rival and former champion Alder, arrived and took Ghetsis away to face justice for his crimes, though he would later escape thanks to the Shadow Triad, his most loyal followers. That left N and the protagonist alone in the throne room, the castle around them slowly beginning to collapse now that Team Plasma's unity had shattered. N approached the protagonist, and for the first time, he spoke without the certainty that had always characterized his words before. N admitted that he had been surprised by what he heard from the protagonist's Pokémon, that their happiness and loyalty had challenged everything he believed. He acknowledged that he had been wrong, that forcing his vision on everyone else without truly understanding the situation had been a mistake. He had pursued his ideals or his truth without wisdom, without balance, without considering that perhaps the world was more complex than he had been taught. But he also said that he still believed Pokémon should be free from suffering, that the abuse and neglect he had witnessed throughout his life were real problems that needed addressing. The solution wasn't separation, he understood that now, but there had to be a way to ensure that Pokémon were treated with respect and care, that the partnerships between humans and Pokémon were built on genuine mutual consent. N thanked the protagonist for showing him a different perspective, for being the opposing hero that the legend required, for defeating him and forcing him to confront his errors. Then climbing onto the back of his dragon, he flew away from the castle, leaving behind everything he had known, everything he had believed, to begin a journey of discovery and understanding. The tragedy of N is not that he was evil, he wasn't. It's not that he was stupid or weak, he was brilliant and strong-willed. The tragedy of N is that his compassion, his love for Pokémon, his desire to end suffering, all the best parts of his character, were twisted and exploited by someone who cared nothing for the cause N dedicated his life to. N was a victim of manipulation, raised in isolation, fed a carefully curated view of reality, turned into a weapon to be wielded by Ghetsis against the people of Unova. His defeat wasn't just losing a battle, it was the complete destruction of his sense of self, the revelation that everything he had built his identity on was a lie constructed by someone else. Yet in that defeat, there was also a seed of hope, the possibility of growth and redemption. N left the castle confused and hurt, but also free from Ghetsis' control for the first time in his life. He had the opportunity now to see the world as it truly was, to form his own opinions based on real evidence rather than manufactured scenarios, to become his own person rather than someone else's tool. But that journey of self-discovery and redemption would take time, and it would be difficult, more difficult than any battle N had ever fought, because the hardest battles are always the ones we fight within ourselves. When we have to confront the possibility that everything we believed was wrong, that Eve hurt people despite our good intentions, that we need to fundamentally change who we are. That's where the story of Pokémon Black and White ends, with N flying off into an uncertain future, leaving behind the ruins of his castle and the shattered remnants of his worldview. Players were left wondering what would become of this tragic figure, whether he would find peace, whether he would be able to build a new understanding of the world to replace the false one Ghetsis had given him. The answer would come 2 years later in the sequel games, Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, where N's journey would continue, where he would face new challenges and new revelations, where his story of tragedy would evolve into a story of redemption. But before we get to that part of N's story, I want to take a moment to talk about what makes his tragedy so powerful as a narrative. In most Pokémon games, the villains are fairly straightforward. Team Rocket wants money and power. Team Magma and Team Aqua have extreme environmentalist ideologies, but they're clearly wrong. Team Galactic follows a leader who wants to destroy the universe and remake it without emotion. These are antagonists, obstacles for the player to overcome, but they're not particularly complex characters. N is different. N's motivations are understandable, even admirable in their basic form. Who wouldn't want to end the suffering of innocent creatures? Who wouldn't be moved by seeing Pokémon who had been abused and neglected? The fundamental impulse driving N, the desire to protect and care for Pokémon, is the same impulse that drives most Pokémon trainers. The difference is that N's expression of that impulse was warped by the manipulation and isolation he experienced. This makes him a far more compelling character than a simple villain. Players can sympathize with N even while recognizing that his methods are wrong. They can understand why he believes what he believes, even as they oppose his actions. And when the truth is revealed, when we learn about N's childhood and manipulation, it's impossible not to feel sorry for him, to wish that things had been different, that he had been given the chance to form a balanced worldview instead of being force-fed extremism. N's story also raises genuinely interesting questions about the ethics of Pokémon training, questions that the franchise typically glosses over. Is it right to catch Pokémon and command them to battle? How do we ensure that Pokémon are treated well? What constitutes consent in a relationship between species with such different forms of communication and such unequal power dynamics? These aren't easy questions, and Pokémon Black and White doesn't pretend to have simple answers. Instead, it presents multiple perspectives and lets players think through the implications themselves. The game's stance seems to be that Pokémon training can be ethical when it's based on mutual respect, care, and genuine partnership. The protagonist Pokémon are happy because they're treated well, because they choose to fight alongside their trainer, because the relationship is built on trust rather than dominance. But the game also acknowledges that abuse happens, that some trainers are cruel or negligent, that the system isn't perfect. N represents an extreme response to a real problem. His solution is to throw out the entire system, to separate Pokémon and humans completely because some humans are bad to their Pokémon. But the game argues through the protagonist's example that the better solution is to address the abuse, while preserving the positive relationships, to hold cruel trainers accountable while celebrating the partnerships built on love and respect. This nuanced approach to the ethics of Pokémon training, paired with N's tragic backstory and genuine character growth, elevates Pokémon Black and White above most other entries in the franchise in terms of narrative sophistication. The story is imperfect. It still has issues with pacing, and some plot points feel rushed, but it attempts something ambitious with N's character and largely succeeds. Part of what makes N's tragedy effective is that it feels real, in a way that video game stories often don't. We've all encountered people whose good intentions were exploited by others. We've all known someone who dedicated themselves to a cause, only to discover they were misled. We've probably all experienced moments where we realized something we believed was wrong, where we had to rebuild our understanding of the world. N's story, despite being set in a fantasy world of magical creatures, touches on very human experiences of manipulation, disillusionment, and growth. The fact that N is trying to do good makes his story more tragic, not less. If he were simply an evil person doing evil things, his defeat would be purely satisfying. But because he genuinely wants to help Pokémon, because his motivations come from compassion, his defeat feels bittersweet. We're glad that his plan was stopped, that the region wasn't forced into an extreme change that would have hurt both humans and Pokémon. But we also feel sorry for N, for the painful realization he has to endure, for the years of his life that were stolen by Ghetsis' manipulation. The developers of Pokémon Black and White clearly put a lot of thought into N's character. His design, with his long green hair and distinctive outfit with the cube hanging from a chain, makes him immediately recognizable and visually interesting. His mannerisms, like the way his text boxes display faster than normal to show how quickly his mind works, add depth to his characterization. The glimpses we get of his childhood through his room in the castle tell us so much about his past without requiring long exposition dumps. Even small details, like the fact that N catches and releases Pokémon constantly, using teams made up of Pokémon found in whatever area he's currently in, reinforce his character. He's not a traditional trainer who keeps the same team throughout his journey. He believes Pokémon should be free, so he catches them for temporary partnerships, battles alongside them briefly, then releases them. It's a practice that seems contradictory, catching Pokémon when you believe they should be free, but it reflects N's internal conflict, his genuine care for Pokémon, in tension with the extremism of his ideology. The music associated with N is also notable. His battle theme has a playful, almost childlike quality that contrasts with the seriousness of the conflict, reflecting N's stunted emotional development. The theme contains elements of mathematical formulas translated into musical notes, a nod to N's genius-level intelligence and the natural number meaning of his name. It's a complex, layered piece that rewards multiple listens and reflection, much like N himself. All of these elements come together to create one of the most memorable characters in Pokémon history. N isn't just an antagonist to be defeated. He's a person with depth, complexity, and a tragic backstory that informs everything he does. His presence elevates the entire game, turning what could have been a standard Pokémon adventure into a story about ethics, manipulation, redemption, and growth. Let's take a moment to appreciate what we've learned so far. We've seen how a child with an extraordinary gift was found by the wrong person at the wrong time, how that gift was exploited to serve someone else's ambitions. We've watched N grow from that manipulated child into a young man who truly believed he was doing the right thing, only to have that belief shattered in the cruelest possible way. We've witnessed the culmination of years of manipulation in the conflict at the Pokémon League, and we've seen the moment when N's worldview came crashing down around him. This is the tragedy of N Harmonia Gropius, a story of good intentions twisted into extremism, of compassion weaponized for evil ends, of a pure heart corrupted not by malice but by isolation and lies. It's a story that resonates because it touches on real human experiences, because it asks difficult questions about ethics and relationships, because it presents a character who is neither pure hero nor pure villain, but something more complex and more interesting than either. Yet within that tragedy lies something else, the possibility that understanding our mistakes doesn't have to destroy us. The recognition that we were wrong, painful as it is, can become the first step toward becoming who we were always meant to be. N flew away from that crumbling castle, carrying the weight of his shattered beliefs, but also carrying the freedom to finally form his own understanding of the world, unfiltered by Ghetsis' manipulation. That's what makes N's story so compelling. It's not just about a conflict between trainers, or a battle between legendary dragons, or even just about the ethics of Pokémon training. At its core, N's story is about finding yourself when everything you thought you knew about yourself turns out to be a lie constructed by someone else. It's about having the courage to admit you were wrong, to change your beliefs when confronted with new evidence, to grow even when growth is painful. These are themes that resonate far beyond the world of Pokémon. Themes that speak to the human condition in profound ways. And that's why, more than 15 years after Pokémon Black and White first released, we're still talking about N, still analyzing his character, still moved by his tragedy. The months following N's departure from Unova were shrouded in mystery. No one knew exactly where he went or what he was doing. The Shadow Triad, when encountered by the protagonist during the post-game of Black and White, mentioned that even they didn't know N's location. He had truly vanished, taking his dragon with him, leaving behind only questions and the ruins of a castle that had collapsed back into the earth. During this time, N traveled the world beyond Unova's borders. He visited other regions, encountered other trainers, spoke to countless Pokémon in his unique way. And everywhere he went, he found the same truth that had troubled him during his encounters with the protagonist. Most Pokémon were happy with their trainers. Most partnerships between humans and Pokémon were built on genuine affection and mutual respect. N met trainers who had rescued Pokémon from abusive situations and nursed them back to health. He encountered Pokémon who had chosen to stay with their trainers even when given multiple opportunities to leave. He witnessed battles where both trainer and Pokémon fought together with perfect synchronization, each understanding the other's intentions without need for words. He saw Pokémon mourning trainers who had passed away, refusing to leave their graves. He observed trainers who had devoted their entire lives to understanding and caring for Pokémon. Each of these encounters chipped away at the absolute certainty Ghetsis had instilled in him. N began to understand that the world was far more complex than the binary of all humans are cruel, or all Pokémon suffer in captivity that he had been taught. Reality existed in shades of gray, in nuance and complexity, in individual relationships that couldn't be reduced to simple generalizations. But N also found evidence that his concerns hadn't been entirely baseless. He still encountered abused Pokémon, still heard stories of cruelty and neglect. He learned about Pokémon being abandoned when they were no longer useful for battles, about trainers who saw their Pokémon as nothing more than tools, about illegal Pokémon fighting rings where creatures were forced to battle to the death for human entertainment and profit. The truth N discovered during his journey was that both perspectives had validity. The relationship between humans and Pokémon could be beautiful or terrible, depending on the humans involved and the choices they made. forcing separation on everyone wouldn't solve the problem of abuse. It would just deprive the good trainers and happy Pokémon of their partnerships. What was needed wasn't revolution, but reform, not destruction of all human Pokémon bonds, but accountability for those who violated the trust that Pokémon placed in them. This realization was both liberating and painful. Liberating because it meant N's fundamental desire to protect Pokémon from suffering wasn't wrong, just his proposed solution. Painful because it meant acknowledging how thoroughly he had been manipulated, how many mistakes he had made, how much harm he had almost caused in pursuit of a goal based on incomplete information. N spent time with people who shared his genuine concern for Pokémon welfare, but approached it in more measured, thoughtful ways. He learned about Pokémon centers and the nurses who dedicated their lives to healing injured Pokémon. He discovered Pokémon sanctuaries that cared for creatures who had been abandoned or abused, working to rehabilitate them and find them new homes with responsible trainers. He met researchers studying Pokémon communication and cognition, trying to better understand what Pokémon needed to thrive. These experiences showed N that there were paths toward improving Pokémon welfare that didn't require dismantling the entire system of human-Pokémon partnership. Change could happen through education, through laws protecting Pokémon from abuse, through better training of new trainers about their responsibilities, through social pressure on those who mistreated their Pokémon. But perhaps the most important thing N learned during his travels was something about himself. For the first time in his life, he was making his own choices. He was forming his own opinions based on his own experiences, rather than accepting what someone else told him to believe. He was becoming his own person, not Ghetsis' tool, not Team Plasma's king, just N, an individual trying to find his place in a complicated world. Yet guilt weighed heavily on him. He had led Team Plasma in attacks on innocent people. He had helped steal Pokémon from their trainers, causing fear and suffering. He had nearly forced his extreme vision on an entire region, regardless of what the people or Pokémon of that region actually wanted. The fact that he had been manipulated didn't erase the harm he had caused. Good intentions didn't undo bad actions. N wrestled with how to make amends for what he had done. He couldn't simply apologize and move on. The scale of his actions was too large for that. He needed to find a way to use his unique gifts and his hard-won wisdom to actually help Pokémon, to make the world better rather than worse. But what form should that help take? How could he contribute positively after having caused so much disruption? These questions occupied N's thoughts as he traveled, and he didn't have easy answers for them. Personal growth, real growth, doesn't come with neat solutions or simple redemption arcs. It's messy and uncertain and requires constantly reevaluating your beliefs and choices. N was learning this lesson the hard way. 2 years passed. 2 years of traveling, learning, growing, struggling with guilt and confusion, and the slow, painful process of building a new understanding of the world. 2 years during which N transformed from the naive, certain young man who had attacked the Pokémon League into someone wiser, humbler, and far more aware of his own limitations and mistakes. And then news reached him from Unova. Team Plasma had returned, but this time, something was different. The organization had split into 2 factions following Ghetsis' defeat and escape. One group, led by the Sage Rude, had taken N's words from the throne room to heart. They recognized that Team Plasma's methods had been wrong, that forcing their ideology on others was itself a form of oppression. This group, sometimes called Old Team Plasma to distinguish them from what came after, dedicated themselves to actually helping Pokémon in need. They established a sanctuary in Driftvale City, a safe place where they cared for Pokémon who had been hurt or abandoned. These former Team Plasma members, many of whom had genuinely believed in the cause of Pokémon liberation and felt betrayed when they learned the truth about Ghetsis, now work to make amends through direct action. They nursed injured Pokémon back to health, helped rehabilitate abused Pokémon, and worked to find good homes for those in their care. Rude himself became a different person after Team Plasma's defeat. The kindly sage, who had always seemed more interested in philosophy than violence, now channeled his energies into compassionate action. He recognized that talk was easy, but helping Pokémon required actual work, dedication, and humility. When the protagonist of Black 2 and White 2 encountered him, Rude even gave them a Zorua that had once belonged to N, entrusting this Pokémon to a trainer he believed would care for it properly. Old Team Plasma members could be found throughout Unova, no longer wearing their knight-inspired uniforms, no longer preaching about liberation, simply trying to live quietly and do what good they could. They knew they couldn't undo the harm they had caused, but they could at least try to do better going forward. It was a humble redemption, one that acknowledged the past rather than trying to erase it. But the other faction, the one that would come to be known as New Team Plasma, took a very different path. This group remained loyal to Ghetsis, and they represented something far more sinister than the original organization ever had. Where Team Plasma had at least claimed to care about Pokémon welfare, even if that claim was a lie, New Team Plasma abandoned even the pretense of noble intentions. They dressed in black paramilitary uniforms, their faces covered, looking more like terrorists than the knights the original grunts had resembled. They operated from the Plasma Frigate, a massive airship that could travel across the region, appearing wherever Ghetsis directed them. New Team Plasma didn't bother with speeches about liberation or trying to convince anyone of their ideology. They simply stole Pokémon, attacked anyone who opposed them, and worked toward Ghetsis' new goal, conquest of Unova through sheer force. If people wouldn't willingly give up their Pokémon, then Team Plasma would take them by force. If the region wouldn't accept Ghetsis as its ruler, then he would freeze it into submission and rule over the ruins. The split between these two factions represented the two sides of the original Team Plasma. Old Team Plasma embodied the genuine believers, those who had actually cared about Pokémon and had been horrified to learn they'd been manipulated. New Team Plasma represented those who had never really cared about the ideology, who had joined for the chance to have power over others, who had been perfectly content serving Ghetsis' real agenda once it was revealed. Leading New Team Plasma was Zinzolin, the sage who specialized in ice-type Pokémon. Zinzolin had always been more aggressive than the other sages, more willing to use violence to achieve Team Plasma's goals. When Ghetsis' true intentions were revealed, Zinzolin didn't feel betrayed. He felt liberated from having to pretend to care about Pokémon rights. Now he could pursue power openly, without the inconvenient need to justify his actions with philosophy. But Ghetsis, paranoid and controlling, as always, didn't fully trust even his most loyal follower. He installed another person as the public leader of the New Team Plasma, a scientist named Colress. This man represented something unique in the Pokémon world, a researcher who cared nothing for the moral implications of his work, only for the results it produced. Colres's area of study was how to draw out the maximum strength from Pokémon. Unlike most Pokémon researchers who approach this question from the perspective of nurturing bonds and understanding Pokémon needs, Colres treated it as a purely technical problem. He developed a machine that could control Pokémon directly, overriding their will and forcing them to fight at their maximum capability regardless of their desires or well-being. This machine was the ultimate expression of treating Pokémon as tools rather than partners. It reduced them to weapons to be wielded, removing their agency entirely. And Colres saw nothing wrong with this. He wasn't cruel in the sense of taking pleasure in Pokémon suffering. He simply didn't consider their suffering relevant to his research. They were test subjects, variables in an equation, means to an end. Ghetsis recruited Colres specifically because the scientist's amorality made him useful. Colres would do whatever Ghetsis asked as long as it furthered his research. No questions asked about the ethics or consequences. And Colres's control machine would be essential to Ghetsis' new plan. That plan centered on Kyurem, the third member of the legendary dragon trio. While Reshiram and Zekrom had chosen heroes to bond with, Kyurem had remained alone in the giant chasm, the frozen crater where it had dwelled for centuries. According to the legend that the people of Lacunosa town told to their children, Kyurem was a monster that would devour anyone who ventured outside the town at night. A terrifying creature that had fallen from the sky in a meteor. The truth about Kyurem was both more complex and more tragic than the legend suggested. Kyurem was the empty shell left behind when the original dragon split into Reshiram and Zekrom. It contained neither truth nor ideals, only the yearning to be complete again, to fill the void where those concepts had once resided. Its body generated immense cold, ice constantly forming on its frozen wings and damaged form, as if the Pokémon was trying to preserve itself against the emptiness within. Kyurem was powerful, perhaps even more powerful than Reshiram or Zekrom individually, but that power was raw, unrefined, lacking the focus that truth or ideals provided. It was a creature of pure potential, waiting for something or someone to give it purpose. Ghetsis saw in Kyurem the perfect weapon. If Reshiram and Zekrom required heroes with strong convictions to bond with them, if they chose their partners rather than being controlled, then Kyurem's emptiness made it ideal for someone who wanted a legendary Pokémon without the inconvenience of being judged worthy. Kyurem could be controlled, forced to serve, used as a tool in a way that the other dragons couldn't. New Team Plasma captured Kyurem, using it to power a massive cannon on the plasma frigate. They demonstrated this weapon's power by attacking Opaloosid City, freezing the entire city in ice. The attack was sudden and overwhelming, giving the city's defenders no time to mount ineffective resistance. Ice-covered buildings, streets, everything, transforming a thriving city into a frozen wasteland in moments. The attack on Opaloosid City had a specific purpose, beyond just demonstrating Team Plasma's power. Drayden, the gym leader of Opaloosid City, possessed the DNA splicers, an ancient artifact connected to the legend of the original dragon. These splicers had the power to fuse Kyurem with either Reshiram or Zekrom, creating Black Kyurem or White Kyurem, forms that combined Kyurem's raw power with the focused strength of truth or ideals. The Shadow Triad, Ghetsis' most loyal servants, infiltrated the frozen city during the chaos and stole the DNA splicers. With this artifact in hand, Ghetsis' plan became clear. He would draw out the trainer who had defeated him 2 years ago, the protagonist of Black 2 and White 2, and he would also lure N back to Unova. N still possessed the dragon he had bonded with, Reshiram or Zekrom, depending on which version of history we follow, and Ghetsis wanted that dragon. If Ghetsis could capture N's dragon and use the DNA splicers to fuse it with Kyurem, he would possess the most powerful Pokémon in Unova, a creature that combined the might of 2 legendary dragons. With that power, nothing could stop him from conquering the region. Not the gym leaders, not the champion, not the protagonist who had defeated him before, no one. The plan was characteristically cruel in its efficiency. Ghetsis would use N's love for Pokémon against him. He would create a situation where N had no choice but to intervene, and then he would steal N's dragon and use it as a component in his weapon. The son would become another tool for the father to exploit, just as N had always been. News of Team Plasma's return and the attack on Pellucid City reached N during his travels. He heard about the split within the organization, about how some of his former followers were trying to make amends, while others had embraced even more extreme methods. He learned about Kyurem's capture, about the DNA splicers being stolen, about Ghetsis' new plan. And N knew he had to return to Unova, not to lead Team Plasma again, not to try to achieve his old goals, but to stop Ghetsis from causing more harm. This time, N would oppose the man who had raised him, would stand against Team Plasma rather than at its head. It was a complete reversal of his role 2 years ago, but it was also the right thing to do. The protagonist of Black 2 and White 2, a young trainer from Asperia City, had been pursuing Team Plasma throughout their journey. They had liberated Pellucid City from the ice, had infiltrated the Plasma Frigate, and defeated Kalres and the Shadow Triad in battle, had followed Team Plasma's trail to their final destination at the Giant Chasm. Deep within the cave at the heart of the Giant Chasm, Ghetsis waited with Kyurem at his side. He had transformed since his defeat 2 years ago. Gone were the sage robes with their eye patterns. Instead, he wore a black outfit with a cape, looking more like the conqueror he had always wanted to be than the wise advisor he had pretended to be. He carried a cane that doubled as a weapon, necessary because his physical condition had deteriorated further, his body bearing more scars from the violence that seemed to follow him. But the most striking change was in his demeanor. Ghetsis had always been cruel, manipulative, willing to use people as tools, but now there was an additional element of desperation and madness. His perfect plan had failed once already. He had been defeated by a child, arrested, forced to escape and hide. His reputation was ruined, his organization split, his adopted son had abandoned him. Everything Ghetsis had worked toward for years had collapsed. This new plan represented his last chance. If he failed again, there would be no coming back from it. This knowledge made him even more dangerous than before. A man with nothing left to lose, a man facing his final opportunity to seize what he believed he deserved. Such a person was capable of anything. The protagonist entered the cave and found Ghetsis there, ranting about his plans, about how he would use Kyurem to freeze all of Unova, about how everyone would bow to him or be destroyed. Kyurem stood beside him, the ice dragon's empty eyes reflecting none of the passion or conviction that Reshiram and Zekrom possessed. It was a weapon, nothing more, forced to serve someone unworthy. Ghetsis commanded Kyurem to attack the protagonist, to freeze them solid with its glaciate attack. The ice dragon gathered power. the temperature plummeting as it prepared to unleash its devastating attack. The protagonist Pokémon readied themselves to defend, but Kyurem's power was immense, and at such close range, there might not be enough time to counter. Then, in a flash of fire or electricity depending on which version of events we follow, the attack was blocked. Reshiram's fusion flare or Zekrom's fusion bolt intercepted Kyurem's ice, the three legendary dragons' powers colliding in the heart of the cave. The force of the clash shook the entire chamber, ice and fire or ice and electricity canceling each other out. En had arrived, riding on his dragon, arriving at the perfect moment to save the protagonist from Ghetsis' attack. The green-haired young man descended from his dragon's back, standing between Ghetsis and the protagonist, facing the man who had raised him with the expression of determination mixed with sadness. En had returned to Unova not for revenge or glory, but to protect the place that had taught him so much, to stop the person who had manipulated him from hurting anyone else. This was En's moment of true heroism, not when he thought he was saving Pokémon by separating them from humans, but when he chose to stand against evil, even though that evil wore the face of his father. Ghetsis looked at En with fury and contempt. He had expected En to return. That was part of the plan. But he had expected En to arrive confused, uncertain, easy to manipulate again. Instead, he saw someone who had grown, changed, become stronger in ways that had nothing to do with Pokémon battles. This En wouldn't be controlled anymore, wouldn't believe Ghetsis' lies, wouldn't serve as a tool. But Ghetsis wasn't concerned. He had planned for this, had prepared for En's arrival. In fact, En being here with his dragon was exactly what Ghetsis needed. With a cruel smile, Ghetsis revealed that En's arrival had been what he wanted all along. The entire situation had been orchestrated to draw En back to Unova with his dragon. Now that En was here, Ghetsis could complete his plan. He pulled out the DNA splicers, the ancient artifact glowing with power. Kyurem responded to the splicer's activation, tendrils of energy extending from its body. En's dragon tried to flee, tried to escape what was coming, but Kyurem's power caught it, pulling it inexorably toward the ice dragon. En watched in horror as his partner, the legendary dragon he had bonded with, was captured by Kyurem's power. The dragon reverted to its stone form, the light stone or dark stone, and Kyurem absorbed it, the stone sinking into the ice dragon's body. The transformation was grotesque. Kyurem's form twisted and changed, absorbing aspects of Reshiram or Zekrom. Black Kyurem and Black 2, gaining Zekrom's power and taking on a more aggressive, bulky appearance with electricity coursing through its body alongside the ice. White Kyurem in White 2, absorbing Reshiram's power and becoming sleeker, more elegant, with flames and ice intertwining in its form. The fused Pokémon was more powerful than either dragon individually, a creature that combined Kyurem's raw strength with the focused power of truth or ideals. It was exactly what Ghetsis had wanted, the ultimate weapon, completely under his control. En fell to his knees as his dragon was absorbed. The bond he had formed with that legendary Pokémon, the connection that had made him a hero in the ancient tradition, was violated in the most fundamental way. His partner had been turned into a component of someone else's weapon, its will overridden, its power stolen. For someone with En's ability to understand Pokémon, to feel what they felt, the experience was devastating. Ghetsis gloated over En's pain. He called En a disappointment again, mocked him for thinking he had changed, reminded him that N would always be nothing more than a tool, a freak, someone who had failed at everything he had tried to do. The verbal abuse was vicious, calculated to cause maximum psychological damage. But this time, N didn't break. He had heard these words before, 2 years ago in the throne room of his castle. They had shattered him then because he had still believed that Ghetsis' opinion of him mattered, that Ghetsis had ever truly been his father. But N had spent 2 years learning to see himself differently, to understand that his worth wasn't determined by what Ghetsis thought of him. N stood back up, facing Ghetsis with quiet strength. He acknowledged that he had failed before, that he had made terrible mistakes, that he had hurt people despite his good intentions. But those failures didn't make him a freak or a disappointment. They made him human, capable of error, but also capable of growth and change. And he would continue to grow, to learn, to try to do better, regardless of what Ghetsis said. Ghetsis, enraged that N wasn't crumbling as he had before, ordered Black Kyurem or White Kyurem to attack. The fused dragon was forced to obey, to use its combined power against the protagonist and N. This battle would determine everything, whether Ghetsis would succeed in conquering Unova, or whether he would be stopped once and for all. The protagonist fought Black Kyurem, or White Kyurem, their team of Pokémon facing down a creature of legendary power. The battle was brutal. The fused dragon commanded ice, electricity, or fire, dragon-type energy, a devastating combination that pushed the protagonist's team to its limits. Pokémon fell, strategies failed, victory seemed impossible. But the protagonist didn't give up. They had traveled across Unova, had formed bonds with their Pokémon through shared struggles, had learned from every gym leader and every challenge they had faced. Their Pokémon fought not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to protect their trainer, to prove that the partnership between humans and Pokémon could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. And slowly, impossibly, they began to turn the battle around. They exploited openings, adapted their strategy, supported each other through the most difficult moments. The fused dragon was powerful, but it was also unstable. 2 legendary Pokémon forced together against their will, neither truly in control. Finally, after a long and desperate struggle, the protagonist's final Pokémon struck the decisive blow. Black Kyurem or White Kyurem fell, the fusion unstable and unable to maintain itself under the assault. The DNA splicer's power failed, and Reshiram or Zekrom separated from Kyurem, reverting to stone form once again. N rushed to his dragon stone, holding it gently. He could feel the dragon inside, exhausted and hurt from being forcibly fused with Kyurem, but still alive, still willing to fight. The bond between them hadn't been broken by what Ghetsis had done, only tested and proven strong enough to endure. Kyurem, freed from the fusion but weakened, retreated to the back of the cave, disappearing into the shadows. It would recover there, would wait for another hero to fill the emptiness inside it, or perhaps would simply remain alone as it had for so long. The ice dragon's role in this story was over for now. Ghetsis stood alone, his ultimate weapon defeated, his plan in ruins once again. And the madness that had been lurking behind his eyes fully emerged. He began ranting, screaming about how his perfect plan had failed again, about how it was impossible for him to lose, about how the world was wrong for not recognizing his genius. The protagonist stepped forward to battle Ghetsis directly. Unlike 2 years ago, when Ghetsis had been confident and controlled during the battle, despite his rage at N's failure, this time he was unhinged, desperate. His team was still powerful, including his Hydreigon that knew frustration, the move that grew stronger the more the Pokémon hated its trainer. But desperation made him sloppy, his commands less precise, his strategy less effective. The protagonist defeated Ghetsis' team, just as the previous protagonist had done 2 years ago. The would-be conqueror fell to his knees, his dreams of ruling Unova crushed for the second and final time. But Ghetsis didn't accept defeat gracefully. He continued ranting, his mind breaking under the weight of his failures. He screamed at N, calling him a freak without a human heart again, blaming N for everything that had gone wrong, unable to accept responsibility for his own choices. N approached Ghetsis, and for a moment there was hope that some reconciliation might be possible. N even addressed Ghetsis as his father, showing that despite everything, some part of him still wanted that relationship to have been real, still wanted to believe that Ghetsis had cared for him even a little bit. But Ghetsis rejected N completely. He spat more abuse, more hatred, making it absolutely clear that N had never been anything more than a tool to him, that there had never been any genuine affection or care. The man who had raised N was incapable of love, incapable of seeing other people as anything more than means to his own ends. The Shadow Triad appeared then, teleporting into the cave. They had remained loyal to Ghetsis throughout everything, and now they fulfilled their final duty to him. They grabbed their master, preparing to teleport away. But before they did, they left Ghetsis' cane behind, a symbolic acknowledgement that his reign of terror had truly ended. As the Shadow Triad teleported away with Ghetsis, they could be heard saying that he had lost control, that he was no longer capable of planning or commanding, that his mind had broken under the stress of his second defeat. The threat that Ghetsis had posed to Unova was over, not because he had been killed or permanently imprisoned, but because his psyche had shattered. He would spend whatever remained of his life lost in madness, unable to hurt anyone anymore. N watched them disappear, and the expression on his face was complex. Relief that Ghetsis couldn't hurt anyone else. Sadness that the man who had raised him, abusive as he had been, had fallen so far. Anger at everything Ghetsis had done, all the pain he had caused, and underneath it all, the beginning of acceptance that this chapter of his life was truly over. The protagonist approached N, and he turned to thank them, and acknowledged that he couldn't have stopped Ghetsis alone, that he needed help, that partnership and cooperation were valuable rather than signs of weakness. He had learned so much during his time away from Unova, but seeing the protagonists fight alongside their Pokémon, watching them overcome impossible odds through trust and teamwork, reinforced those lessons in a powerful way. N asked the protagonist to take care of Kyurem. The ice dragon was still in the giant chasm, still alone, still empty. But perhaps a trainer with a strong heart and genuine care for Pokémon could help Kyurem find what it was looking for, could help fill the void inside it with something other than another's will imposed from outside. Then N left the cave, emerging into the sunlight outside the giant chasm. The forest had been damaged by the plasma frigate's impact and Kyurem's power. Trees broken and scattered, but life was already returning. Pokémon were emerging from hiding, beginning the work of rebuilding their habitat. Nature was resilient, and so were the creatures who called it home. Outside the cave, N found members of old Team Plasma waiting, led by Rude. They had come when they heard about the confrontation at the giant chasm, wanting to help stop Ghetsis, but arriving too late to participate in the battle. Now they stood ready to assist with the aftermath, to help repair the damage, to do whatever was needed. Rude approached N and spoke with him quietly. The old sage expressed regret for his role in N's upbringing, for not questioning Ghetsis more, for allowing N to be raised in isolation and manipulation. He acknowledged that Team Plasma's original ideology, even if Ghetsis had never believed in it, had contained seeds of truth, that Pokémon welfare was important, and that some humans did mistreat their partners. But Rude had learned, as N had learned, that extremism wasn't the answer. Positive change came from education, from compassion in action, from working within communities to establish better standards and hold abusers accountable. Old Team Plasma was trying to embody these principles now, trying to actually help Pokémon rather than just talking about it. N listened to Rude's words and nodded. He forgave the old sage, understanding that Rude too had been manipulated by Ghetsis, that they had all been pieces in a game none of them fully understood until it was too late. What mattered now was learning from those mistakes and doing better. The protagonist emerged from the cave, and N spoke with them one final time before leaving. He told them about his journey over the past 2 years, about everything he had learned, about how grateful he was that they had shown him a different path 2 years ago in his castle. If the protagonist hadn't defeated him then, if they hadn't challenged his beliefs, N might have continued down his misguided path until he caused even more harm. N summoned his dragon from its stone, the legendary Pokémon emerging in a burst of light and taking form once again. The dragon was tired, but healed, its bond with N intact despite Ghetsis' violation of it through the forced fusion. N climbed onto the dragon's back, and together they took to the sky, flying away from the giant chasm. But this time, N didn't disappear completely. He told the protagonist where he would be, invited them to visit. After the protagonists completed their challenge of the Pokémon League and became champion, after they captured Kyurem and added it to their team, N could be found waiting in specific places at specific times. Every Friday, N would appear outside the Ferris wheel in Nimbasa City. If the protagonist rode the wheel with him, they could talk, could share their thoughts about Pokémon and the bonds between species. These conversations revealed how much N had grown, how much more balanced his perspective had become. He still cared deeply about Pokémon welfare, still believed that abuse and neglect were serious problems, but he no longer advocated for extreme solutions. He had learned nuance, learned to appreciate the complexity of ethical questions rather than seeking simple answers. After riding the Ferris wheel with N, the protagonist could travel to the ruins of N's castle, the structure that had collapsed back underground after Team Plasma's defeat 2 years ago. The Zoroark that had been guarding Victory Road would lead the way to a hidden entrance, a path that descended deep beneath the Pokémon League, into the remains of what had once been Team Plasma's headquarters. N would be waiting there in the ruins, walking through the remnants of his past. The castle was a shadow of what it had been, walls crumbling, rooms collapsed, everything decaying back into the earth. But some areas remained accessible, including N's old room, with its childish decorations and toys, stark reminders of the boy he had been, the innocence that had been exploited. N would guide the protagonist through the ruins, sharing stories about his childhood, about the years he spent isolated in this place, about the beliefs he had formed while surrounded by wounded Pokémon. He didn't excuse his actions, but he provided context, helped the protagonist understand how he had become the person he was. Eventually, they would reach the throne room, the place where everything had changed 2 years ago. Standing in that room again, N would reflect on the battle they had fought there, on how his defeat had been the best thing that could have happened to him, even though it hadn't felt that way at the time. Then N would challenge the protagonist to a battle, not out of hostility or a desire to prove superiority, but as a way of connecting, of testing how much both of them had grown. His dragon, Reshiram or Zekrom, would face the protagonist's team in a rematch that echoed their first battle in this room, but with a completely different emotional context. The battle would be difficult. N had grown stronger during his travels, had learned new strategies, had formed a deeper bond with his dragon, but ultimately the protagonist would win again, proving that their partnership with their Pokémon was just as strong as ever. After the battle, N would ask the protagonist to take his dragon. He would explain that the dragon had told him it wanted to go with the protagonist to experience partnership with this trainer who had defeated it twice, to understand why its chosen hero had been surpassed by this person. This was a profound gesture on N's part. The dragon had been his partner, his companion, one of the few beings he had truly connected with. Giving it to the protagonist wasn't about admitting defeat or weakness. It was about trusting that the dragon would be well cared for, about respecting the dragon's own choice, about recognizing that true love for Pokémon meant allowing them to make their own decisions, even when those decisions were painful. The protagonist could then take the dragon to Dragon Spiral Tower, the place where N had first awakened it 2 years ago, and revive it from its stone form. The dragon would join the protagonist's team, adding its legendary power to their roster. After this, if the protagonist returned to the giant chasm and captured Kyurem, N would appear again to acknowledge that they had completed what he had asked. The 3 dragons of legend were now all with the protagonist, truth and ideals and the emptiness between them. All 3 aspects of the original dragon united in one trainer's care. This outcome represented something beautiful symbolically. The protagonist, who had shown throughout their journey that humans and Pokémon could form genuine partnerships built on mutual respect and trust, now possessed all 3 legendary dragons. They embodied the balance that N had been unable to achieve, the integration of truth and ideals, the willingness to acknowledge both the reality of the world and the vision of what it could become. N would continue to appear in the ruins of his castle once per month after these events, and the protagonist could battle him again. His team would change with the seasons, reflecting the natural cycles of the world, showing that N had learned to appreciate change and adaptation rather than clinging to rigid beliefs. These battles were friendly competitions, opportunities for both trainers to test themselves and their Pokémon, to push each other to grow and improve. Through all of these encounters, players could see the completion of N's character arc. The naive, manipulated young man who had attacked the Pokémon League 2 years ago had become someone wise, thoughtful, and genuinely helpful. He had processed his trauma, learned from his mistakes, and found a way to use his unique gifts to contribute positively to the world. N's presence in Black 2 and White 2 was more limited than in the original games. He appeared less frequently, and his role in the main plot was relatively brief. But what little we saw of him showed tremendous growth. He he had become the person he was, always capable of being, free from Ghetsis' manipulation, able to form his own opinions and make his own choices. The contrast between N in black and white and N in black 2 and white 2 is striking. In the original games, he was the primary antagonist, appearing regularly throughout the story, challenging the protagonist multiple times, his presence dominating the narrative. He was central to everything that happened, the king of Team Plasma, the hero of legend, the person trying to force massive change on the entire region. In the sequels, he was a supporting character, appearing only a few times, helping the protagonist briefly before stepping back. He wasn't trying to change the world anymore, wasn't seeking grand gestures or sweeping reforms. Instead, he was focused on understanding, on learning, on connecting with Pokémon and people in more personal, intimate ways. This shift from protagonist of his own story to supporting character in someone else's story might seem like a demotion, but it actually represents growth. N had learned that he didn't need to be at the center of everything, that he didn't need to be the hero who saved everyone. Sometimes the most important work was quiet and personal, helping individual Pokémon, forming genuine relationships, supporting others in their efforts rather than trying to lead massive movements. The themes of N's story in Black 2 and White 2 centered on redemption and forgiveness, both from others and from oneself. N had to forgive himself for his mistakes, had to accept that his good intentions didn't erase the harm he had caused, but also didn't define him forever. He had to learn that people could change, that past errors didn't have to determine future choices, and others had to decide whether to forgive N, whether to trust that his transformation was genuine, whether to give him the chance to prove through actions rather than just words that he had changed. The protagonist's willingness to engage with N, to ride the Ferris wheel with him, to battle him in the ruins of his castle, to accept his dragon as a gift. All of these actions represented a form of forgiveness, an acknowledgement that N had grown and deserved the opportunity to move forward. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. The ruins of N's castle remained beneath the Pokémon League, a permanent reminder of what had almost happened, of the danger that comes from allowing good intentions to override wisdom and humility. The split in Team Plasma into two factions showed the long-term consequences of extremist movements. Even after the original organization fell, its effects continued to ripple through the region. Old Team Plasma members, working in their sanctuary in Driftvale City, faced ongoing suspicion and distrust from many citizens. People remembered the attacks, the stolen Pokémon, the fear that Team Plasma had caused. The fact that these particular members now claimed to have reformed didn't erase that history, and they had to work hard to rebuild trust through consistent actions over long periods of time. This was true for N as well. Most people in Unova remembered him as the king of Team Plasma, the person who had attacked the Pokémon League, who had nearly forced everyone to give up their Pokémon. His transformation was known to relatively few. The protagonist, some of the gym leaders, Rude, and a handful of old Team Plasma members. To the general population, N was still viewed with suspicion and fear. N seemed to accept this. He didn't seek public redemption or try to rehabilitate his reputation on a large scale. Instead, he focused on the personal, on individual connections, on small acts of kindness and care. If most people never knew that he had changed, that was acceptable. He wasn't doing the work of self-improvement for recognition or praise, but because it was the right thing to do. This humble approach to redemption was perhaps the clearest sign of how much N had truly changed. The old N, the one driven by Ghetsis' manipulation and his own absolute certainty, would have wanted to announce his transformation to everyone, to make grand proclamations about his new understanding. The new N understood that actions spoke louder than words, that true change was demonstrated through consistent behavior over time, rather than through speeches or declarations. There was also something poignant about N's continued isolation, even after his redemption. He had learned to form healthier relationships, to connect with others in more authentic ways, but he still seemed fundamentally alone. He traveled constantly, rarely staying in one place for long. His closest relationships appeared to be with Pokémon rather than with humans, which made sense given his unique ability, but also suggested lingering difficulty with human connection. This loneliness wasn't necessarily tragic. Some people are simply more comfortable with solitude, more fulfilled by travel and exploration than by putting down roots in a community. N seemed to have found a way of life that suited his nature, that allowed him to use his gifts while respecting his own needs and limitations. But there was still a melancholy to his story, a sense that the childhood trauma and manipulation had left permanent scars that even the most profound growth couldn't completely erase. The relationship between N and the protagonist in Black 2 and White 2 was also interesting to examine. In the original games, they'd been adversaries, opposed in their visions for the world, even as N called the protagonist his friend. That dynamic had shifted to something more like genuine friendship, or at least mutual respect in the sequels. The protagonist of Black 2 and White 2 never knew the old N, never faced him at the Pokémon League or heard his speeches about liberation. To them, N was someone who had helped them defeat a dangerous villain, who had shared his wisdom and his dragon, who treated them with kindness and respect. They could accept N at face value rather than having to reconcile his current self with memories of who he used to be. This dynamic showed another aspect of N's redemption. With people who had known him before, there would always be the shadow of his past actions, the memory of the person he used to be. But with new people, he had the opportunity to start fresh, to be judged on his current character rather than his history. This didn't erase his responsibility for his past, but it did give him room to build new relationships without the weight of that history constantly pressing down. The question of accountability was never fully resolved in N's story. Ghetsis faced consequences for his actions, arrested after the first game, descending into madness after the second. Many Team Plasma grunts also faced legal repercussions for their crimes, but N himself seemingly faced no official punishment for his role in Team Plasma's attacks. This absence of legal consequences could be interpreted in different ways. Perhaps the authorities recognized that N had been manipulated, that he was more victim than perpetrator. Perhaps his cooperation in stopping Ghetsis during Black 2 and White 2 earned him clemency. Or perhaps he simply disappeared before he could be arrested, and by the time he returned to Unova 2 years later, pursuing him was no longer a priority compared to dealing with new Team Plasma. The games never explicitly addressed this question, leaving it open to interpretation. But the absence of punishment didn't mean N faced no consequences. He lived with the guilt of his actions, with the knowledge of the harm he had caused. He worked to make amends not because he was forced to, but because he chose to. His redemption came through internal change and positive actions rather than through serving a sentence or paying a fine. This approach to redemption focused on personal growth and making amends rather than on punishment and retribution, aligned with Pokémon's generally optimistic worldview. The franchise has always emphasized second chances, the possibility of change, the belief that people aren't defined solely by their worst moments. N's story embodied these themes while still acknowledging the seriousness of his actions and the difficulty of truly changing. The symbolic importance of the legendary dragons in N's story deserves attention as well. Reshiram and Zekrom, representing truth and ideals, reflected the central tension in N's character. He pursued what he believed was an ideal world where Pokémon were free from human control, but the truth he encountered through his interactions with the protagonist contradicted that ideal. When N lost the battle at his castle, it wasn't just a defeat in a Pokémon battle. It was truth or ideals, proving stronger than his version of the same concepts. The protagonist's truth, that Pokémon and humans could form genuine partnerships, or the protagonist's ideals, that working together was better than forced separation, were more powerful than N's truth or ideals because they were based on real experience rather than manufactured scenarios. The fact that N's dragon eventually chose to go with the protagonist represented the completion of this symbolic journey. Even the legendary dragon recognized that N's original understanding had been flawed, that the protagonist offered something N couldn't. A partnership built on true mutual respect and understanding, rather than on the need to prove an ideology correct. Kyurem's role in the story added another layer to this symbolism. The empty dragon, containing neither truth nor ideals, represented what N had been under Ghetsis' control, a vessel being filled with someone else's agenda, lacking genuine self-determination. Ghetsis' attempt to forcibly fuse Kyurem with N's dragon was an attempt to return N to that empty state, to make him a tool again. The protagonist's eventual capture of Kyurem and the bringing together of all three dragons suggested wholeness, integration, the balance of truth and ideals with the acknowledgement of emptiness and potential. It was a happy ending to the legend. The three parts of the original dragon finally reunited, not through force but through choice, not under the control of someone seeking power, but in partnership with someone who genuinely cared for Pokémon. Looking at N's story from a broader narrative perspective, it's remarkable how much depth and complexity the Pokémon franchise achieved with his character. Pokémon games are typically not known for sophisticated storytelling or morally complex characters. The plots usually follow a fairly standard formula. Young trainer journeys through a region, challenges gyms, stops a criminal organization, becomes champion. But N's story broke that mold. His presence turned Pokémon Black and White from a standard Pokémon adventure into a narrative that grappled with questions of ethics, manipulation, extremism, and redemption. It asked players to think about the fundamental premise of Pokémon. Is it okay to catch and train these creatures? And while it ultimately affirmed that yes, Pokémon training can be ethical when done right, it didn't dismiss the questions as invalid. This willingness to engage with the potentially problematic implications of the Pokémon world, to acknowledge that the relationship between humans and Pokémon requires thought and care rather than being automatically good, gave the story a level of maturity that most Pokémon games lack. It respected players' intelligence, trusted them to think through complex issues rather than presenting everything in simple black and white terms. The irony of a game called Black and White engaging so thoroughly with shade of gray wasn't lost on fans. The titles themselves suggesting a binary contrasted with the nuanced narrative that questioned simplistic divisions. Truth and ideals, the themes of the legendary dragons, weren't presented as opposites that needed to choose between them, but as complementary concepts that both had value. N embodied this complexity. He wasn't a villain in the traditional sense, wasn't motivated by greed or cruelty or a desire for power. He was someone trying to do good who had been manipulated into pursuing that good in catastrophically wrong ways. He represented the danger of absolute certainty, of believing so strongly in your righteousness that you're willing to force your vision on others without their consent. But he also represented the possibility of growth and change. The N of Black 2 and White 2 was a fundamentally different person than the N of Black and White. Not because his core values had changed, but because he had learned wisdom, humility, and the importance of actually listening to the voices of those he claimed to want to help. In this case, the Pokémon themselves. This character arc, from misguided extremist to wise helper, from manipulated tool to self-determined individual, from someone certain of his righteousness to someone humble about his limitations, was one of the most satisfying redemption stories in gaming. It felt earned rather than convenient, the result of genuine internal work rather than a simple declaration that he had changed. The developer's decision to make N a sympathetic antagonist rather than a straightforward villain was crucial to the story's success. Players could understand N's motivations even while opposing his methods. They could feel sorry for him when his world was shattered in the throne room. They could root for his growth during the 2 years between games. And they could feel genuinely happy when he appeared in Black 2 and White 2, having found a better path. This emotional investment in N's journey elevated the entire experience of playing these games. Battles against him felt meaningful, not just mechanical challenges to overcome, but confrontations with someone whose beliefs were important to him, whose defeat would have real emotional consequences. The victory in his throne room was bittersweet, because while it saved Unova from forced change, it also destroyed N's entire worldview. Similarly, the moment when N arrived at the giant chasm to help fight Ghetsis felt triumphant, not just because it turned the tide of the battle, but because it showed how far N had come. The same person who had attacked the Pokémon League 2 years ago was now defending it, standing against the man who had manipulated him, choosing to be a hero in the true sense rather than just someone playing a role assigned by someone else. The writing quality of N's dialogue contributed significantly to his characterization. His speech patterns reflected his character, mathematical precision in Black and White, showing his calculating approach and his training in sociology, more natural and emotional language in Black 2 and White 2, showing his growth and his reconnection with his own feelings. The quick text speed associated with his dialogue boxes showed his rapid thinking, while the content of what he said revealed his constantly evolving understanding of the world. Small touches like N's habit of tilting his head when thinking, his distant expression when listening to Pokémon, his genuine joy when riding the Ferris wheel in Nimbasa City. All of these details made him feel like a real person rather than just a plot device. The designers clearly put thought into every aspect of his character, from his visual design to his mannerisms to his philosophy. The visual design of N and Team Plasma also supported the themes of the story. N's outfit, with its mathematical cube puzzle, green natural coloring, and mix of formal and casual elements, suggested someone caught between worlds, not quite fitting in anywhere. His long hair, unusual for male Pokémon characters, made him distinctive and memorable, while also suggesting a certain disconnection from social norms. Team Plasma's night motif in black and white suggested crusaders fighting for a righteous cause, which was exactly how they saw themselves, even though their cause was based on manipulation. The shift to a more militant, pirate-like aesthetic for new Team Plasma in the sequels showed the loss of that facade of nobility, the embrace of naked aggression over ideological justification. Ghetsis' design also told a story. His elaborate robes with eye symbols suggested surveillance and control. His monocle and hidden arm implied injury and vulnerability beneath the facade of power. His evolution from sage robes to dark conqueror outfit tracked his increasingly desperate and unhinged state. The visual storytelling supported and enhanced the narrative in subtle but effective ways. The music associated with N and Team Plasma also deserves recognition. N's battle theme, with its mathematical formula elements and playful quality, perfectly captured his character. The Team Plasma battle themes' aggressive energy communicated their zealotry. Ghetsis' battle theme, one of the most intense in the entire Pokémon franchise, reflected his cruelty and madness. The music team understood the story being told and created soundscapes that supported it at every turn. Looking at N's story through a thematic lens reveals even more layers. At its core, this is a story about the importance of complete information in forming beliefs. N was manipulated specifically through the control of information, only ever exposed to Pokémon who had been abused, never seeing the full picture of human Pokémon relationships. His extremism came directly from this incomplete understanding. This theme has obvious real-world relevance. People can be radicalized, can be led to extreme positions when they're only exposed to information that supports a particular worldview. Filter bubbles, echo chambers, propaganda, these are all methods of controlling information to shape beliefs. N's story illustrated the danger of this in a way that was accessible to young players while still being sophisticated enough to resonate with adults. The story also explored the ethics of ends and means. N believed his goal of ending Pokémon suffering was noble, and in the abstract, it was. But the means he pursued, forcing everyone to give up their Pokémon regardless of their wishes or the wishes of the Pokémon themselves, were unjust. The story argued that you can achieve a truly good outcome through unethical means, that the methods matter as much as the goals. This is a profound ethical principle, one that people struggle with throughout their lives. When is it acceptable to override people's choices for what you believe is their own good? How do you balance individual freedom with preventing harm? These questions don't have easy answers, and the games didn't pretend they did. But they explored the questions through N's story in ways that encouraged thought and reflection. The theme of redemption and second chances pervaded N's arc. He made serious mistakes, hurt people, nearly caused catastrophic harm to an entire region. But he was also a victim of manipulation, someone who genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. Did he deserve a second chance? The games answered yes, but not without consequences, not without the hard work of genuinely changing and making amends. This balanced approach to redemption felt right, N wasn't instantly forgiven, wasn't immediately trusted, didn't get to just say sorry and move on. He had to demonstrate through consistent actions over time that he had changed. He had to live with the guilt and the consequences of his actions, but he also got the opportunity to grow, to become better, to use his gifts for good rather than harm. The story suggested that people aren't defined solely by their worst actions, that growth is possible, that past mistakes don't have to determine future choices, but it also acknowledged that redemption is difficult, that trust once broken is hard to rebuild, that consequences can be lasting even when forgiveness is offered. This nuanced approach to a complex moral situation showed a level of sophistication unusual for the franchise. Another major theme was the importance of questioning authority and thinking for oneself. N's tragedy came from accepting what Ghetsis told him without question, from not seeking out alternative perspectives, from not trusting his own doubts. His redemption came when he finally started making his own choices based on his own experiences rather than on what he had been taught. This theme of critical thinking and intellectual independence is crucial for young people especially, the primary audience for Pokémon games. The message that you should question what you're told, seek out multiple perspectives, and form your own opinions based on evidence rather than just accepting authority is valuable. N's story illustrated this message in a compelling, memorable way. The games also explored the concept of absolutes versus nuance. N's original worldview was absolute. All Pokémon training was bad. All Pokémon needed to be freed. There was no middle ground. This absolutism was part of what made his position extreme and dangerous. His growth came when he learned to think in terms of nuance, to recognize that some Pokémon training was bad, but other forms were good, that the situation was complex and required thoughtful analysis rather than simple rules. Learning to think in terms of nuance rather than absolutes is a key part of intellectual and moral development. Young people often think in black and white terms, and learning to see shades of gray is part of maturing. N's character arc modeled this development, showing the limitations of absolute thinking and the value of embracing complexity. The story also touched on themes of identity and self-determination. N had been told who he was by Ghetsis, given a role to play, a purpose to fulfill. His journey was about discovering who he actually was beneath the programming, about becoming his own person rather than someone else's creation. This theme of finding authentic selfhood resonates with anyone who has struggled to separate their own desires and beliefs from what others expect of them. There was also a theme of the dangers of isolation. N's manipulation was possible because he was isolated from alternative perspectives, kept in his castle, only exposed to carefully curated information. His growth required him to venture out into the world, to encounter diverse people and Pokémon, to test his beliefs against reality. The story suggested that isolation makes us vulnerable to manipulation, and that exposure to diversity of thought protects us from extremism. These themes, complex and sophisticated, were woven throughout N's story in ways that enhanced rather than overshadowed the core Pokémon gameplay. Players could engage with these ideas as deeply or as shallowly as they wanted. Someone just playing through the story casually would still have a good time, while someone paying close attention could find layers of meaning to unpack. The legacy of N's character extends beyond just the black and white games. He appeared in Pokémon Masters, a mobile game featuring characters from throughout the franchise, where his characterization continued to reflect his growth and development. He was referenced in later games as an example of the complex storytelling Pokémon could achieve when it pushed beyond its comfort zone, and became a fan-favorite character, inspiring countless fanworks, analyses, discussions. People who played Black and White as children remembered him years later, remembered his story, remembered the questions his character raised about the ethics of Pokémon training. He had staying power, remaining relevant and interesting long after the initial games released. This lasting impact came from the quality of his writing and characterization. N felt like a real person with understandable motivations and believable growth. His story touched on themes that mattered, that resonated with people's own experiences of manipulation, growth, and self-discovery. He represented the potential of Pokémon storytelling when the developers were willing to take risks and engage with more mature themes. The psychological depth of N's character becomes even more apparent when we examine the specific mechanisms of his manipulation and recovery. Ghetsis employed techniques that mirror real-world cult indoctrination and abuse patterns, the isolation from alternative perspectives, the controlled information environment, the installation of an us versus them mentality, the elevation to a special status that made questioning seem like betrayal. All of these are recognized methods of psychological control. What made Ghetsis' manipulation particularly insidious was how he used N's genuine gift against him. N's ability to communicate with Pokémon was real and profound. The Pokémon he spoke to in his childhood really had been abused, really were suffering. Ghetsis didn't need to fabricate evidence of human cruelty toward Pokémon because such evidence genuinely existed. He simply needed to ensure that was the only evidence N ever encountered. This created a situation where N's beliefs were based on actual facts, just an incomplete set of them. He wasn't delusional or irrational given the information he had access to. His logical reasoning was sound. His conclusions followed naturally from his premises. The problem was that his premises were deliberately skewed through the curation of his experiences. This made his beliefs much harder to shake than if they had been based on obvious falsehoods. When the protagonist Pokémon contradicted N's understanding by expressing happiness and contentment, it created cognitive dissonance that N struggled to resolve. He had two conflicting pieces of information: his lifetime of experience showing Pokémon suffering under human control, and this immediate evidence of Pokémon thriving in partnership with a human. His initial response was to treat the latter as an exception, an outlier that didn't disprove the general rule. This is a common psychological defense mechanism when confronted with information that challenges core beliefs. But as N encountered more and more exceptions, as he saw that happy Pokémon trainer partnerships were actually the norm rather than the outlier, the cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. This is when real psychological distress set in. Accepting that his worldview was wrong meant accepting that everything he had dedicated his life to was misguided, that he had hurt people in pursuit of a flawed goal, that the person who raised him had lied to him about the fundamental nature of reality. The battle in his throne room, where N was defeated by the protagonist, represented the breaking point where the cognitive dissonance became too great to maintain his beliefs. The defeat wasn't just tactical, it was existential. If his convictions weren't strong enough to achieve victory, if the legendary dragon that had accepted him as a hero couldn't overcome a trainer with genuine bonds with their Pokémon, then perhaps his understanding of the world really was flawed. Ghetsis' revelation immediately afterward, while devastating, might actually have helped in an unexpected way. By revealing that the ideology had been a manipulation all along, Ghetsis provided N with a framework for understanding why his worldview had been wrong. It wasn't that N was stupid or bad at reasoning. He had been deliberately fed false information by someone he trusted. This external attribution of responsibility, while not excusing N's actions, made it psychologically easier for him to accept that his beliefs had been wrong. The 2 years N spent traveling after these events represented a period of intensive psychological recovery and reconstruction. He needed to build a new understanding of the world from the ground up, one based on his own observations rather than on what he had been taught. This process would have been extraordinarily difficult and painful. Trauma survivors, especially those who have experienced prolonged manipulation from childhood, often struggle with basic questions of identity and trust. Who am I if not the person I was told I was? How can I trust my own judgment when it was so thoroughly manipulated before? How do I distinguish between genuine beliefs and programmed responses? These questions would have haunted N during his travels. The fact that N emerged from this period as a relatively stable, functional person speaks to his resilience and the support he must have received, even if that support wasn't explicitly shown in the games. The Pokémon he traveled with likely played a crucial role in his recovery. They accepted him without judgment, provided companionship without manipulation, reminded him that relationships based on genuine mutual care were possible. N's decision to help stop Ghetsis at the giant chasm was significant psychologically. It represented N choosing to confront his abuser, to take action against the person who had controlled him for so long. This kind of confrontation, while not necessary or healthy for all abuse survivors, can be empowering for some. It allowed N to reclaim agency, to demonstrate that he was no longer under Ghetsis' control, that he could stand against his abuser rather than submitting to him. The scene where N addressed Ghetsis as his father, even after everything Ghetsis had done, revealed the complexity of their relationship. Abusive relationships, especially those formed in childhood, create complicated emotional bonds. The abuser is often someone the victim loves, someone they depend on, someone whose approval they crave even while suffering under their control. N calling Ghetsis his father showed that some part of him still wanted that relationship to have been real, still hoped for recognition or reconciliation. Ghetsis' complete rejection of N, calling him a freak without a human heart one final time, was cruel, but also clarifying. It removed any lingering ambiguity about whether Ghetsis had ever cared for N. This absolute rejection, while painful, might have actually helped N move forward. There was no longer any hope for reconciliation. No reason to wonder whether Ghetsis might change or acknowledge his wrongs. The door was closed, and N could begin to truly let go. The parallel between N's journey and the journey many people face when leaving controlling relationships or ideological systems is striking. Cult survivors, people escaping abusive families, individuals de-radicalizing from extremist movements, all face similar challenges to what N experienced. They must rebuild their understanding of the world, learn to trust their own judgment, form new relationships based on healthier patterns, and find ways to make amends for actions they took while under someone else's influence. N's story validated these experiences, showed them in a context that young people could understand and relate to. Many players who identified with N might not have even realized why his story resonated so deeply. Perhaps they too had experienced manipulation on some scale, had believed things that turned out to be wrong, had struggled to form their own identity separate from what others expected of them. N's journey of growth and recovery offered hope that such struggles could be overcome. The relationship between N and the protagonists of both games deserves further examination. In Black and White, the protagonist served as N's foil, representing an alternative way of relating to Pokémon that N couldn't initially understand. Their Pokémon's voices contradicted everything N believed, creating the cognitive dissonance that ultimately led to his transformation. But the protagonist never treated N as a simple enemy. They could have dismissed him as a villain, refused to engage with his ideas, simply fought to stop him without trying to understand. Instead, through their actions and the testimony of their Pokémon, they offered N evidence of a different possibility. They challenged his beliefs not through argument, but through example. This approach was more effective than direct confrontation would have been. If the protagonist had simply argued with N, telling him he was wrong, he likely would have become defensive and dug deeper into his beliefs. But by showing him an alternative rather than just telling him about it, they gave N something concrete to compare against his existing worldview. In Black 2 and White 2, the dynamic shifted. The new protagonist didn't know N's full history, didn't have the baggage of having opposed him before. This allowed for a more straightforward relationship, based on their current selves rather than on past conflicts. N could be helpful and friendly without the weight of previous antagonism hanging over their interactions. The gift of N's dragon to the protagonist in Black 2 and White 2 represented the ultimate symbol of trust and growth. Dragons in the Pokémon world are powerful but also proud, and legendary dragons especially are not easily convinced to follow a new trainer. That N's dragon chose to go with the protagonist, and that N supported this choice, showed how far he had come in understanding that true care for Pokémon meant respecting their agency and choices. This gesture also represented N's acceptance that he didn't need to be special, didn't need to be the hero of legend to have value. His worth wasn't tied to possessing a legendary dragon, or being the king of Team Plasma, or achieving some grand destiny. He could simply be himself, helping where he could, learning and growing, forming genuine connections. This shift from grandiosity to humility was a crucial part of his healing. The seasonal team's N, used in his monthly rematches in the ruins of his castle, showed his growing connection to the natural cycles of the world. Spring teams, featuring Pokémon associated with new life and growth. Summer teams with vibrant, energetic Pokémon. Autumn teams with Pokémon connected to harvest and preparation. Winter teams with Pokémon adapted to cold and scarcity. This attention to seasonal change reflected N's developing appreciation for natural rhythm and cycles, for change as a constant rather than something to fear or resist. Each season's team told a story about N's current state of mind. The spring team suggested renewal and hope. The summer team showed vitality and energy. The autumn team reflected on maturity and preparation for harder times. The winter team acknowledged difficulty while maintaining resilience. Through these rotating teams, players could see N's emotional journey continuing even after the main plot concluded. The choice to have N return to his castle ruins for these battles was significant. Rather than running from his past or trying to forget it, N chose to inhabit those spaces, to make peace with his history. The castle was still a place of painful memories, but by returning to it and using it as a place for friendly battles and connection, N reclaimed it. He transformed it from a symbol of his manipulation into a space where he could create new, healthier memories. This willingness to confront rather than avoid painful reminders of his past demonstrated psychological maturity. Many people who have experienced trauma or manipulation try to completely cut themselves off from anything associated with those experiences. While this can be necessary in the short term, true healing often requires eventually being able to encounter reminders without being overwhelmed by them. N showed this kind of integrated healing, acknowledging his past while not being controlled by it. The presence of his old room in the ruins, with its childish toys and decorations still visible, added poignancy to these encounters. Players walking through that room before battling N in the throne room were confronted with visual evidence of the childhood that had been stolen from him. The toys that should have represented innocent play instead represented isolation and manipulation. Yet N brought the protagonist there willingly, shared that vulnerability with them, trusted them with the truth of his past. This openness about his history, rather than trying to hide the shameful or painful parts of his story, suggested N had worked through a significant amount of his trauma. People often feel intense shame about experiences of manipulation or abuse, as if being victimized somehow reflects poorly on their character or intelligence. The fact that N could show someone his old room, could talk about his childhood, suggested he had moved past some of that shame to a place of acceptance. The role of Anthea and Concordia in N's life also warrants deeper exploration. These two women occupied a strange position in Team Plasma's hierarchy and in N's personal life. They were his foster sisters, but also his caretakers, and also subordinates to Ghetsis. They genuinely cared for N, but they also enabled his isolation and manipulation by participating in the system Ghetsis created. In the original Black and White, Anthea and Concordia appeared only briefly in N's castle, where Concordia made her famous statement about N's heart being pure and innocent, and nothing being more beautiful and terrifying than innocence. This line perfectly encapsulated the tragedy of N's situation. His purity, his genuine belief in his cause, made him both admirable and dangerous. The sisters seemed to understand, at least partially, that N was being manipulated. Concordia's statement suggested awareness that innocence could be weaponized, that purity of intention didn't guarantee good outcomes, yet they didn't intervene to stop Ghetsis or warn N. Whether they were too afraid of Ghetsis, too indoctrinated themselves, or simply didn't fully grasp the extent of the manipulation until it was too late remains unclear. In Black 2 and White 2, Anthea and Concordia appeared with the old Team Plasma faction in Driftvale City. They revealed more about their own history, explaining that they too were orphans Ghetsis had adopted. This detail added another layer to the tragedy. Ghetsis had created an entire false family, adopting multiple children to serve various roles in his schemes. Anthea and Concordia were tasked with raising N, shaping him to become the king Ghetsis needed. The sisters expressed regret for their role in N's upbringing, acknowledging that they should have questioned Ghetsis more, should have exposed N to different perspectives. This admission of responsibility, even while acknowledging they too were victims of Ghetsis' manipulation, showed moral courage. it's easier to simply blame the primary abuser and absolve oneself of any responsibility. But Anthea and Concordia recognized that they had participated in harming N, even if unintentionally. Their decision to stay with Old Team Plasma and work to help Pokémon in need represented their own form of redemption. Like N, they were trying to make amends for their past actions by doing better going forward. The parallel between their journey and N's reinforced the theme that people who have been part of harmful systems can choose to change and work toward repair. The question of whether N maintained a relationship with Anthea and Concordia after the events of Black 2 and White 2 was left unanswered by the games, given that they all seem to be working towards similar goals, caring for Pokémon welfare through compassionate action rather than extremist ideology. It would make sense for them to have stayed in contact. They shared a unique history, understood each other's trauma in ways that outsiders couldn't, and could potentially support each other in their ongoing healing. However, it's also possible that N needed distance from Anthea and Concordia, at least for a time. They were so tied up with his traumatic childhood, so associated with the castle and Team Plasma and Ghetsis, that being around them might have been painful. Sometimes healing requires creating space from people connected to our trauma, even when those people weren't directly responsible for causing it, and even when we care about them. The ambiguity about these relationships after the main plot concluded was actually realistic. Real healing isn't neat, doesn't wrap up in a tidy conclusion. Relationships are complicated, especially when they're formed in the context of shared trauma, and might sometimes want connection with Anthea and Concordia, and other times need solitude. He might forgive them while still finding their presence difficult. Human relationships, especially those forged in complicated circumstances, rarely fit into simple categories of maintained or severed. The 7 sages beyond Ghetsis also had interesting relationships with N. These were the men who had helped raise him, who had participated in his education, who had presented themselves as wise advisors to their king. After Team Plasma's defeat, their reactions varied significantly, revealing the diversity of motivations and beliefs within the organization. Rude, as mentioned earlier, became the leader of Old Team Plasma and worked toward genuine Pokémon welfare. His transformation seemed sincere, suggesting he had truly believed in the original ideology and felt betrayed when Ghetsis' true intentions were revealed. His conversation with N at the Giant Chasm, where he apologized for his role in N's upbringing, showed genuine remorse and a desire to make amends. Zinzolin remained loyal to Ghetsis, commanding new Team Plasma forces and participating in the attack on Opelucid City. His choice suggested he had never really cared about the liberation ideology and was perfectly content serving Ghetsis' naked ambition once the pretense was dropped. The fact that he specialized in ice-type Pokémon, creatures associated with cold and harshness, seemed fitting for someone who embraced cruelty so readily. The other sages, Ryoku, Gorm, Giallo, and Bronius, were encountered during the post-game of Black and White, hiding in various locations around Unova. When found, they surrendered without much resistance and spoke about their beliefs and regrets. Their dialogue suggested they had genuinely believed in Team Plasma's stated goals and struggled with the revelation of Ghetsis' deception. These sages represented the rank-and-file believers of extremist movements, people who join because they're convinced by the ideology rather than seeking power for its own sake. They weren't evil people necessarily, but they had allowed their beliefs to justify questionable actions, convinced that the ends justified the means. Their post-game dialogue showed them grappling with that realization, trying to understand how they had been so thoroughly deceived. The way the game treated these sages with relative mercy, allowing them to surrender peacefully rather than facing harsh consequences, reflected a compassionate approach to dealing with people who have been part of harmful movements. It acknowledged that not everyone who participates in wrongdoing does so with malicious intent, that some people are genuinely misled, and that punishment isn't always the most productive response to such situations. This treatment paralleled how N himself was handled. He wasn't imprisoned or punished harshly, despite his central role in Team Plasma's actions. Instead, he was given the opportunity to learn, grow, and make amends. This approach suggested that rehabilitation and education were more valuable than retribution, especially for people who had been manipulated or genuinely believed they were doing good. Of course, this merciful treatment was only extended to those who showed genuine remorse and worked to change. Ghetsis, who showed no remorse and remained dedicated to his harmful goals, faced consequences, even if those consequences came in the form of mental breakdown rather than legal punishment. The distinction between N and the remorseful sages on one hand, and Ghetsis and Zinzolan on the other, established a moral framework. People who acknowledge their mistakes and try to do better deserve opportunities for redemption, while those who persist in causing harm need to be stopped. The Shadow Triad, Ghetsis' most loyal servants, occupied an interesting position in this moral framework. They remained loyal to Ghetsis throughout everything, helping him escape after his first defeat, serving him during the events of Black 2 and White 2, and finally removing him from the giant chasm when his mind broke. Yet they weren't portrayed as unambiguously evil. The Shadow Triad's loyalty seemed to stem from gratitude. According to their own accounts, Ghetsis had saved their lives at some point, and they felt indebted to him. This created a complicated ethical situation. They were enabling someone who was clearly causing harm, but their motivation was loyalty and honor, rather than malice or greed. They knew Ghetsis was wrong, seemed to recognize that his plans were evil, but felt obligated to support him anyway. This portrayal of the Shadow Triad raised questions about the ethics of loyalty. When is it right to remain loyal to someone even when they're doing wrong? At what point does loyalty become complicity? The Shadow Triad chose loyalty even when it meant helping Ghetsis hurt others, and the games didn't present this choice as admirable, but they also didn't completely condemn them as irredeemable villains. Their final act, removing Ghetsis from the giant chasm, and acknowledging that he had lost control and could no longer function, might have been motivated by mercy as much as loyalty. They couldn't save Ghetsis from the consequences of his actions or from his own mental breakdown, but they could at least remove him from the situation before anything worse happened. This act suggested some awareness on their part that Ghetsis' path had led to destruction and that he needed help rather than continued enablement. The fate of the Shadow Triad after removing Ghetsis remained unknown. Did they continue caring for him in his broken state? Did they eventually abandon him once their debt of honor was satisfied? Did they turn themselves in for their crimes? The games left these questions unanswered, allowing players to imagine various possibilities. This ambiguity was appropriate given the Shadow Triad's mysterious nature. Throughout their appearances, they remained enigmatic, appearing and disappearing via teleportation, speaking in stylized language, operating in perfect coordination. They were more like forces of nature than fully developed characters, bound by their code of loyalty in ways that made them both honorable and troubling. The broader question of what happened to all of Team Plasma's members after the organization's collapse was also left largely unexplored. We saw old Team Plasma working in Driftvale City, and we encountered new Team Plasma as enemies throughout Black 2 and White 2. But many ordinary grunts must have simply returned to civilian life, trying to reintegrate into society after being part of a notorious criminal organization. These former grunts would have faced significant challenges. They would be recognized and stigmatized by many people in Unova. Finding employment would be difficult with a background in Team Plasma. Some might face legal consequences for their actions during the organization's active period. Others might struggle with their own guilt and confusion about having been part of something that turned out to be so different from what they believed. The game hinted at these struggles through occasional NPC dialogue, but didn't explore them in depth. This was understandable given the game's focus on the player's journey and the central conflicts, but it left room for players to imagine the broader societal impact of Team Plasma's rise and fall. In the real world, the collapse of extremist movements leaves complicated legacies, and the Pokémon world would be no different. The fact that Team Plasma could rise in the first place, that they gained enough support to be a serious threat, suggested that their message resonated with at least some segment of Unova's population. Even though their methods were criminal and their leadership corrupt, the underlying concern about Pokémon welfare wasn't entirely baseless. Some Pokémon were mistreated, some trainers were irresponsible or cruel, and the system could have done more to protect Pokémon from abuse. Team Plasma's existence and the crisis they created might have actually led to positive changes in Unova's approach to Pokémon welfare. Perhaps new laws were passed to protect Pokémon from abuse. Perhaps training licensing became more stringent. Perhaps organizations dedicated to genuine Pokémon protection gained more support and resources. These kinds of systemic changes often emerge from crises. As societies recognize that problems need to be addressed to prevent future extremist movements from exploiting those same issues. If such changes occurred, they would represent a small silver lining to the Team Plasma crisis. N's misguided revolution, while it failed and caused harm, might have at least drawn attention to real problems that needed addressing. This didn't justify his actions, but it meant they weren't entirely without positive consequence. Sometimes even failed movements for change can inspire the broader society to address the legitimate concerns that motivated people to join those movements in the first place. The lasting impact on N himself, beyond his personal growth and healing, included his ongoing work to understand and bridge the gap between humans and Pokémon. His unique ability to communicate with Pokémon gave him insights that could be valuable to researchers, trainers, and Pokémon welfare advocates. If N chose to share his knowledge and perspectives, he could contribute significantly to improving human-Pokémon relations throughout the Pokémon world. We saw hints of this potential contribution in his interactions with the protagonists. He shared his insights about Pokémon communication, helped them understand their Pokémon's perspectives, facilitated deeper connections between trainers and their partners. This educational role suited N well, allowing him to use his gifts in positive ways without requiring him to be a leader or to force his views on others. N might have also contributed to Pokémon rehabilitation efforts, using his communication abilities to help traumatized or mistreated Pokémon heal and learn to trust again. This work would be deeply meaningful to him, directly addressing the suffering that had motivated his original crusade, but doing so through compassionate action rather than revolutionary violence. He could give voice to Pokémon who couldn't communicate their needs through normal means, advocate for those who were suffering, and help ensure they received appropriate care. The question of whether N ever fully forgave himself for his role in Team Plasma's actions remained open. Forgiveness, particularly self-forgiveness, is a process rather than a single moment. N could accept that he had been manipulated while still feeling guilt about the harm he caused. He could recognize that he had grown and changed while still wishing he had made different choices originally. He could work to make amends while still carrying the weight of his mistakes. This ongoing struggle with self-forgiveness would be realistic. People who have caused harm, even unintentionally, often carry that burden for life. They learn to live with it, to accept it as part of their history without letting it define them completely. But it never entirely disappears. N would likely have moments throughout his life when he thought about what he did, felt fresh waves of regret, wondered if he had done enough to make up for it. These moments of doubt and guilt wouldn't represent failure in his healing process, but rather a realistic acknowledgement that some wounds never completely close. The goal isn't to forget the past or to reach a point where we feel no regret about our mistakes. The goal is to integrate those experiences into our understanding of ourselves, to let them inform our future choices without paralyzing us, to use them as motivation to do better rather than as evidence that we're fundamentally broken. N's willingness to keep moving forward despite this burden, to keep trying to help Pokémon and to form genuine connections despite the risk of making mistakes again, demonstrated real courage. It would have been easier for him to withdraw completely, to avoid any situation where he might cause harm, to let fear of repeating past errors prevent him from taking action at all. Instead, he chose engagement, chose to trust his own judgment despite knowing it had failed him before, chose to believe he could do good even though he'd been manipulated into doing harm. This courage to continue despite uncertainty, to act despite the possibility of error, to trust oneself despite past failures, these are essential to human growth and agency. N embodied this kind of courage, and his example provided a model for players grappling with their own mistakes and uncertainties. The enduring cultural impact of N's character extends beyond just the Pokémon community. He has been analyzed in academic papers about narrative in video games, discussed in psychology forums as an example of realistic portrayal of manipulation and recovery, referenced in discussions about redemption arcs and morally complex characters. His story transcended the medium that created it, becoming relevant to broader conversations about storytelling, ethics, and human nature. Fan artists and writers have created countless interpretations of N's story, exploring moments the games didn't show, imagining his life during the 2 years between Black and White and their sequels, depicting his ongoing adventures and growth. This creative engagement demonstrated how deeply N's character resonated with players. People wanted to spend more time with this character, to understand him more fully, to see him continue to grow and heal. The fan community's treatment of N was generally sympathetic, recognizing him as a victim of manipulation rather than dismissing him as a simple villain. This spoke to the effectiveness of his characterization and also to the emotional intelligence of Pokémon fans, who could recognize the complexity of his situation and extend compassion to someone who had made serious mistakes while under someone else's control. Some fans who had experienced manipulation or abuse in their own lives found N's story particularly meaningful. They saw their own struggles reflected in his journey, found validation in the portrayal of how difficult it is to recognize and escape manipulation, felt hope from his eventual recovery and growth. For these players, N was more than just a video game character. He was a representation of their own experiences and a symbol of the possibility of healing. The fact that a Pokémon game, a franchise often dismissed as childish or simplistic, could provide this kind of meaningful representation and inspire this kind of emotional connection demonstrated the potential of video games as a storytelling medium. Games can tackle serious themes, can provide complex characters, can resonate with players' real experiences in ways that create lasting impact. N's story also contributed to broader shifts in how Pokémon games approach storytelling. While subsequent games haven't all matched the narrative ambition of Black and White, the success of N's character arc demonstrated that Pokémon fans appreciated more sophisticated storytelling. This likely influenced later games to attempt more character-driven narratives and to explore more mature themes, even if they didn't always reach the same heights. The relationship between gameplay and narrative in N's story also deserves recognition. The fact that players battled N multiple times throughout the games, that these battles served narrative purposes beyond just being boss fights, integrated the gameplay and story in meaningful ways. Each battle represented an ideological clash, a test of convictions, a step in N's evolving understanding of the world. The post-game battles with N in both games, where players could face him again in friendly competition, transformed the meaning of combat in the game. Fighting was no longer about defeating an enemy, but about connection, about testing each other, about mutual growth through challenge. This recontextualization of the battle system to serve character development and relationship building showed sophisticated understanding of how game mechanics could support narrative goals. The seasonal rotation of N's teams in the Black 2 and White 2 post-game, mentioned earlier, also demonstrated how gameplay systems could reflect character growth. The fact that N's teams changed with the seasons, that players could return to battle him again and again and find new challenges each time, kept him relevant and interesting long after the main plot concluded. It gave players a reason to continue engaging with his character, to see his ongoing journey, to maintain connection with him. This ongoing engagement transformed N from a character you encountered during a single playthrough into someone who remained part of your experience with the game for as long as you continued playing. He became a companion in your own journey through the post-game content, someone you could return to for challenge and connection. This long-term presence deepened the relationship between player and character, making N feel more like a real person you knew rather than just a plot device. The decision to make N's dragon transferable to the player in Black 2 and White 2, to literally give players this legendary Pokémon that had been so central to N's identity, represented ultimate trust and generosity. Legendary Pokémon in the games are rare and special, representing significant achievements. For N to give up his dragon showed he had moved beyond needing external markers of worth, beyond defining himself by his special status or his possession of powerful Pokémon. This gift also created a tangible connection between player and character. Every time you used N's dragon in battle, you were reminded of him, of his story, of his growth and transformation. The dragon became a living symbol of N's journey, carrying his legacy forward as you continued your own adventure. This kind of mechanical reinforcement of narrative themes exemplified how good game design could enhance storytelling. The tragedy of N. Harmonia Gropius was that a child with extraordinary gifts was found by the wrong person and molded into a weapon. But the triumph was that this same person broke free from that manipulation, grew beyond his programming, and became who he was meant to be. His story was one of pain and growth, of manipulation and liberation, of mistakes and redemption. In telling this story, Pokémon Black and White achieved something special. They created a character whose complexity and depth elevated the entire franchise, who showed that Pokémon stories could tackle serious themes and moral questions while still being accessible and entertaining. They proved that family-friendly games didn't have to be simplistic, that young players could handle and benefit from stories that challenged them to think. N's tragedy reminds us that good intentions aren't enough, that we must always question what we're told, seek out complete information, and remain humble about the possibility that we might be wrong. His redemption shows us that people can change, that past mistakes don't have to define us forever, that growth is possible even after catastrophic failures. These lessons, embedded in a story about a green-haired young man who could talk to Pokémon, have resonated with millions of players around the world. And that resonance, that lasting impact, that ability to make people think and feel and grow through engagement with a character's journey, that's the mark of truly great storytelling. The tragedy of N. Harmonia Gropius ended not in despair but in hope. Hope that understanding could replace manipulation. Hope that wisdom could be learned even through painful experience. Hope that someone who had been used as a tool could become a person, whole and authentic and free. And perhaps that's the most important message of all, that it's never too late to change, never too late to question, never too late to grow into who you're meant to be rather than who someone else tried to make you. N's story, with all its complexity and nuance, delivered that message beautifully. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of Pokémon's most fascinating characters. If this exploration of N's tragedy resonated with you, consider subscribing to see more content like this, where we dig deep into the lore, the themes, and the stories that make these games meaningful beyond just the mechanics. And hit that like button if you enjoyed this analysis. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content exploring the deeper aspects of Pokémon storytelling. N. Harmonia Gropius, the king who became a wanderer, the tool who became a person, the tragic figure who found redemption. His story continues to matter because it speaks to fundamental human experiences of manipulation, growth, and the search for authentic identity. And in a franchise built on the bonds between humans and creatures of incredible power, his story reminds us that the most important battles are often the ones we fight within ourselves, the struggles to understand who we are and who we want to become. That's the true tragedy and triumph of N. Harmonia Gropius, a character who will remain one of Pokémon's finest achievements in storytelling. A testament to what the franchise can accomplish when it's willing to take risks and trust its audience with stories that matter